Chapter I. The Knocking at Caversham Square. In glancing over my old journals, those weathered volumes in which I have preserved such records of the singular adventures shared with my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I find no case more curious in its commencement, nor more disturbing in its implications, than the affair which eventually became known in the press as the case of the stranger who knocked every night. Even now, years after its conclusion, there remains in my memory something peculiarly oppressive about those events. A sensation akin to hearing, far down a deserted corridor, the measured tread of footsteps approaching one's chamber door. It began in the autumn of 1894, during one of those bleak London weeks when the fog rolls low across the streets like drifting smoke from unseen furnaces. The gas lamps glimmered dimly through the murk. Hansom cabs moved like shadows upon the wet pavements, and every sound seemed muffled beneath the heavy sky. Holmes had been in an intolerably restless condition for several days. He lounged that evening upon the settee at Baker Street, his long fingers joined beneath his hawk-like nose, while the violin rested neglected upon the chair beside him. The Persian slipper containing his tobacco hung from the mantelpiece, and the air was dense with the acrid aroma of strong black shag. I had observed in Holmes that peculiar irritability which invariably accompanied a period of intellectual stagnation. He had refused 3 cases in succession, one involving a forged will in Kensington, another concerning a missing diplomatic dispatch, and a third relating to matrimonial indiscretions in Surrey. Each, according to Holmes, suffered from an appalling deficiency of imagination. "You astonish me, Holmes," said I, laying aside my medical journal. The last gentleman seemed prepared to pay handsomely. Holmes gave a weary wave of his hand. "My dear Watson, money is the least interesting feature of crime. The true study lies in motive, contradiction, and the curious blindness of the human mind. A husband who keeps 2 mistresses and loses a memorandum is scarcely worth my violin string. You may regret dismissing honest clients. Honest clients are the dullest of all clients." He rose, abruptly, and crossed toward the window. Pulling aside the curtain, he peered down into Baker Street. "Observe, Watson," I joined him. A stout gentleman in a brown ulster stood across the street beneath the lamp, apparently occupied with lighting a cigar. "A respectable tradesman," said I. Holmes chuckled softly. "Recently bankrupt, formerly prosperous, nervous disposition. Possesses a revolver which he has never fired." I stared at him. "My dear Holmes." The elbows of the coat are shiny from habitual leaning upon a counter, ink upon the thumb and forefinger. An accountant or merchant. Boots recently resoled but coat carefully brushed. Reduced means, lingering pride. His right pocket sags heavily and asymmetrically, a revolver. Yet the pocket remains buttoned despite easy access. He carries it for reassurance, not use. Elementary. Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon her tray. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says the matter is most urgent." Holmes glanced at the card and raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Adrian Bellamy, of Caversham Square. Show him up." A moment later, our visitor entered. He was a man of perhaps 45 years, tall and spare, with iron-grey hair brushed carefully backward from a narrow brow. His face possessed that peculiar refinement one associates with scholars or barristers, yet his eyes betrayed profound exhaustion. His gloves trembled faintly in his hands. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" "I am. Pray sit down. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson." Bellamy bowed distractedly before lowering himself into the chair opposite the fire. "I have come," said he, "because I can no longer persuade myself that the matter is explainable by ordinary means." Holmes leaned back with sudden interest. "That," said he, "is often an encouraging beginning." Bellamy attempted a smile but failed. "I scarcely know where to begin." "With the facts," Holmes replied, "never with conclusions." The gentleman passed a hand across his brow. "I reside at number 7, Caversham Square. For the last 11 nights, at precisely 2:30 in the morning, someone has knocked upon my front door." He paused. And when the door is opened, there is no one there." Holmes closed his eyes. Continue. At first I believed it some drunken prank. My servant investigated but found the square deserted. On the second night I remained awake myself. Again the knocking came, 3 measured raps. I opened the door within seconds. Nothing. You are certain? Perfectly. Holmes steepled his fingers. The knocks always identical. Yes. 3 knocks, yes. Loud, firm, deliberate. And every night at exactly the same hour, Bellamy shuddered. To the minute. Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. Interesting. Very interesting. I should not have troubled you over so absurd a matter, Bellamy continued, were it not for what occurred 3 nights ago. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. This was found upon the step. Holmes unfolded it carefully. Upon the page, written in neat black ink, appeared a single sentence. I shall enter soon. Even I confess the message sent an unpleasant sensation through me. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated. Excellent, he exclaimed. Bellamy stared. Excellent, my dear sir. Do not mistake me. Your discomfort is regrettable, but from the standpoint of analytical inquiry, your case has at last acquired shape. Bellamy swallowed hard. You do not think the matter supernatural? Holmes gave an impatient snort. I have yet to encounter a ghost capable of mastering a Yale lock. Bellamy attempted another wan smile. There is more, said he quietly. Holmes settled deeper into his chair. Go on. Yesterday morning I discovered footprints beneath my study window. Footprints? In the flower bed. Large impressions, as though left by a heavy man, yet no attempt at entry. None. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Curious indeed. And what of your personal circumstances, Mr. Bellamy? Enemies? Disputes? Family quarrels? Bellamy hesitated. I am a widower. My wife died 6 years ago. I have no children and live with a single servant, Mrs. Graves. Profession? I lecture occasionally on ancient languages. My principal income derives from investments. No recent disagreements? Again, Bellamy paused. There was a disagreement some months ago with a former acquaintance. Holmes' voice sharpened instantly. A man or woman? A man. Lionel Moberly. The name appeared unfamiliar to Holmes. The nature of the dispute. Bellamy looked uncomfortable. Financial. How much money? £5,000. I gave a low whistle. Holmes' expression remained impassive. You lent him the money? No. He attempted to persuade me into financing an enterprise in South America. I refused. He became extremely bitter. Describe him, Bellamy complied. Moberly, it appeared, was a broad-shouldered adventurer with military bearing, a dark beard and violent temper. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And when did you last see him? Nearly 4 months ago. Did he threaten you? Not directly. Yet he remarked, before leaving, that certain doors open whether one wishes them to or not. Holmes' eyelids drooped slightly, a sure sign of deep concentration, and this phrase impressed you. It did after the knocking began. Holmes rose suddenly. Watson, your hat. You intend to visit the house tonight? Immediately, Bellamy started. At once. My dear sir, your unknown visitor has maintained admirable punctuality. We should be poor students indeed. Were we not present to greet him? Within half an hour we were rattling westward in a hansom through the fog-bound streets. Caversham Square proved a sombre and respectable enclave near Bayswater. A row of tall Georgian houses, surrounding a fenced garden blackened by autumn rain. Number 7 stood at the northern corner, its upper windows faintly illuminated. Inside, the house possessed an oppressive stillness. Mrs. Graves, a gaunt elderly woman with hollow cheeks, admitted us. Her anxious glances toward the front door suggested nerves already strained near breaking point. Bellamy led us into the study. A spacious chamber, lined with bookshelves, and dominated by a large mahogany writing desk. Holmes immediately became transformed. The languor vanished from him entirely. He moved with feline alertness about the room, examining carpets, curtains, locks, and window latches with extraordinary precision. At last he knelt beside the hearthrug. Ha! What is it? I cried. Holmes pointed silently. There, upon the dark fabric, lay several tiny grains of pale grey powder. He touched them delicately and sniffed. Not ash, said he softly. Bellamy looked bewildered. Should there be powder upon my hearthrug? That depends entirely upon who placed it there. Holmes crossed to the window. Outside, beneath the sill, the flower bed indeed showed deep impressions in the damp soil. Holmes crouched over them for several moments. "Large boots?" said I. "Yes, but observe the depth." "I see little." "Exactly. A man of heavy tread but surprisingly lightweight. Curious." Bellamy stared helplessly from one to the other of us. "Can you make sense of it?" "Not yet." Holmes straightened. "Tell me, Mr. Bellamy, has anything whatsoever disappeared from the house?" "Nothing." "No papers disturbed?" "No." "No valuables missing?" "No." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then your visitor seeks not theft, but access." "Access to what?" "That, unfortunately, remains the essential question." The clock upon the mantel chimed the quarter hour. Holmes glanced toward it. "We shall remain tonight." Bellamy paled. "You believe he will come again?" "My dear sir," said Holmes dryly, "habit is the foundation of criminal mediocrity." And so we waited. Outside, the fog thickened against the windows like dirty wool pressed to the glass. Somewhere far off a cab rattled faintly through the night. Then all was silent once more. Holmes sat motionless in the shadows, his eyes half closed. Bellamy paced nervously beside the fire. As for myself, I confess that, despite all reason, I experienced an uncomfortable anticipation. There was something peculiarly sinister in the notion of those nightly knocks. At precisely 2:30 the sound came. 3 slow raps, not loud, not hurried, yet so deliberate and coldly confident that every hair upon my neck stiffened instantly. Bellamy gave a strangled gasp. Holmes was already moving. In 2 noiseless strides, he reached the hall and flung open the front door. Fog swirled inward from the square. The street beyond lay empty. But as Holmes stepped onto the threshold, his hand shot suddenly downward. Then he uttered a sharp exclamation. "What is it?" I cried, rushing forward. Holmes held up an object between finger and thumb. It was a small ivory button, and from somewhere within the darkness of the square came the faint sound of retreating footsteps. Chapter 2. The ivory button. For several seconds after the sound had faded into the fog, none of us spoke. Holmes remained standing upon the threshold, perfectly still, his lean figure half veiled by the drifting mist. The solitary gas lamp at the corner of the square cast a wan circle of light across the wet pavement. But beyond that pale circumference London dissolved into darkness. Then Holmes closed the door softly and returned to the study. Without a word, he placed the ivory button beneath the lamp. Bellamy bent forward anxiously. "Do you recognize it?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He drew a lens from his pocket and examined the object with minute attention. It was a curious button, slightly larger than those ordinarily found upon gentlemen's garments, yellowed with age, and engraved at its centre with a tiny device resembling a serpent wound around a staff. "Well?" I asked. Holmes leaned back. "It is old," said he, hand-carved. "Certainly not modern manufacture. Could it belong to the intruder?" "My dear Watson, objects seldom materialize independently upon front steps at 2:30 in the morning." Bellamy passed a trembling hand over his mouth. "Then the man was there, close beside the door?" "Undoubtedly. But how could he vanish so quickly?" Holmes smiled faintly. "London contains many convenient shadows." He rose abruptly and turned to Bellamy. "I should like to inspect the remainder of the house." Bellamy took up the lamp. "Certainly." We proceeded upward through a broad staircase lined with sombre portraits whose dark eyes seemed to follow our ascent. The atmosphere of the house affected me disagreeably, though orderly and tastefully furnished. It possessed none of the warmth one associates with a lived-in home. Every sound, the creak of a board, the rustle of curtains stirred by hidden draughts, seemed unnaturally distinct. Holmes moved swiftly from room to room. The bedrooms upon the second floor revealed nothing unusual. The windows were latched securely, the fireplaces cold, the furniture undisturbed. At last we entered Bellamy's private study above the library, a smaller chamber overlooking the square. Here Holmes halted immediately. "Ah," I followed his gaze. Upon the writing table stood a framed miniature portrait of a woman. She was strikingly handsome, with dark, intelligent eyes, and a proud mouth touched by melancholy. Her dress, though modest, suggested refinement. "My wife," said Bellamy quietly. Holmes studied the portrait with unusual attention. "She died 6 years ago, you said?" "Yes." "Of what illness?" Bellamy hesitated almost imperceptibly. "Consumption," Holmes nodded. "Indeed." He crossed to the shelves lining the far wall. "What subjects occupy your interest, Mr. Bellamy?" "History chiefly. Classical languages. Eastern antiquities." Holmes ran a finger along several bindings. Greek manuscripts, Persian trade routes, Syriac theology." He paused before one shelf. "This section appears recently disturbed." Bellamy looked surprised. "I consulted one of the volumes yesterday." "Only one?" "Yes." Holmes said nothing further, but I noticed the faint tightening about his eyes which indicated growing interest. At length we returned downstairs. Bellamy insisted that we remain the night, and shortly before dawn Mrs. Graves prepared rooms for us. Holmes, however, showed no inclination towards sleep. I found him seated beside the fire at 7 o'clock that morning, clad in his dressing gown and smoking with intense concentration. "You have formed a theory?" I asked. "A fragment of one. And the button?" Holmes tossed it lightly toward me. "Examine the engraving." I obeyed. "The serpent and staff," said I. "Medical, perhaps?" "An understandable assumption, Watson, though incorrect." "What then?" Holmes drew from the shelf one of his enormous scrapbooks devoted to criminal records and obscure references. "Observe." He opened to a yellowed newspaper cutting. At the head appeared the title, "The Society of the Veiled Serpent." I looked up sharply. A secret society. An absurdly melodramatic name, certainly. Yet the organisation existed. A minor fraternity among certain antiquarians and collectors during the 1860s. What became of it? It dissolved after allegations of fraud and smuggling. Several members vanished abroad. And the button belonged to them? Holmes tapped the clipping. Their insignia. I confess the revelation produced in me a thrill of excitement. "You think Bellamy connected with them?" "Possibly. Yet why conceal it?" Holmes stretched his long legs toward the fire. "Because concealment is humanity's most universal instinct." At that instant, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes opened it swiftly. "Lestrade," said he. "How gratifying." "What does he say?" Holmes handed me the message. "Come at once. Important development. Arranging Caversham Square." Lestrade. "Then the matter has reached Scotland Yard," said I. "My dear Watson, any occurrence sufficiently theatrical eventually attracts Lestrade." Within the hour we arrived at the yard. Inspector Lestrade received us in a state of unusual agitation. The little detective's sharp ferret-like features appeared positively triumphant. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he, rubbing his hands, "the case is nearly finished." Holmes sank lazily into a chair. "Indeed? We've found your midnight visitor." "Excellent." Lestrade produced a photograph. A man named Felix Corbin, actor by profession, petty swindler by habit. The photograph depicted a broad-faced fellow with theatrical eyebrows and an unpleasant grin. "Arrested?" asked Holmes. "Not yet, but we shall have him before nightfall." "And the evidence?" Lestrade swelled visibly. "A witness saw Corbin lurking near Caversham Square on several occasions. Furthermore, we searched his lodgings this morning." "And?" "We discovered papers linking him to Adrian Bellamy." Holmes yawned faintly. "What nature of papers?" "Letters demanding money. Blackmail? So it appears." Holmes closed his eyes entirely. Lestrade frowned. "You don't seem impressed." "My dear Lestrade, I am reserving judgment until I hear something improbable." The inspector sniffed irritably. "There's more. Corbin possesses a coat missing an ivory button." That roused me instantly. "The button. Exactly," said Lestrade smugly. Holmes opened one eye. "Most convenient. What do you mean by that?" "My dear fellow, when evidence arranges itself with perfect neatness, one should always suspect the furniture has been moved." Lestrade flushed. "You think I'm wrong? I think you are premature." The inspector slapped the desk. "Corbin threatened Bellamy repeatedly. He was seen near the square. His coat lacks a matching button. What more do you require? A motive for knocking instead of entering?" Lestrade stared. "What? If Corbin sought money, why indulge in 11 nights of melodrama? Why not confront Bellamy directly? Why no burglary? Why no assault? Lestrade opened his mouth, then shut it again. Holmes continued quietly. You assume the knocking itself constitutes intimidation. I suspect it is communication. Communication with whom? That, said Holmes, remains delightfully obscure. We left Scotland Yard shortly thereafter. As our cab crossed Marylebone Road, I turned to Holmes. You truly disbelieve Corbyn's guilt? Not entirely. He may participate in the affair, but Lestrade mistakes a pawn for a king. Then what troubles you? Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his cigarette. Bellamy. Bellamy? There are omissions in his narrative. What sort? He fears something beyond mere harassment. You notice that also, particularly when discussing his wife. I stared. You think her death significant? Holmes smiled slightly. My dear Watson, in criminal investigation, the dead frequently exert more influence than the living. We spent the afternoon in research. Holmes consulted directories, shipping registries, and several obscure historical indexes. By evening, our rooms at Baker Street resembled the office of an antiquarian scholar rather than the residence of a consulting detective. At 6:30, Holmes suddenly sprang upright. Watson, your revolver. You expect danger. I expect clarity, which is often more hazardous. Where are we going? To the theatre? The theatre? Precisely. He smiled with rare amusement. If Felix Corbyn is indeed an actor, let us observe his stagecraft. The Lyric Theatre in Holborn proved crowded that evening, filled with fashionable ladies and cigar-smoking gentlemen escaping the dampness outside. Corbyn appeared in a melodrama of extraordinary stupidity, involving pirates, hidden diamonds, and mistaken identities. Yet, despite the absurdity of the production, the actor himself commanded attention. He was a powerfully built man, with a resonant voice and exaggerated gestures suited to cheap theatrics, but beneath his flamboyance I sensed nervousness. Holmes observed him intently through opera glasses. Notice the left hand, he murmured. What about it? A tremor. Drink, perhaps? No, fear. During the second act, Holmes abruptly rose. Come. We slipped from the theatre and made our way behind the stage through a maze of narrow passages, smelling of grease paint and damp canvas. A startled stagehand attempted to stop us, but Holmes brushed past with complete indifference. We found Corbyn alone in his dressing room, removing his costume. He leapt to his feet as we entered. What the devil? Holmes closed the door quietly. Mr. Felix Corbyn, I believe. What business is this? Holmes seated himself calmly. A simple inquiry regarding Adrian Bellamy. At the name, the actor's face changed. Not anger, not surprise, terror. He backed against the table. I know nothing. On the contrary, said Holmes softly, you know a very great deal. Corbyn's eyes darted toward the door. Holmes sighed. Pray do not attempt melodrama. Real life rarely survives it. I've done nothing. You have frightened a man half to death for 11 consecutive nights. Corbyn wiped sweat from his brow. You don't understand. Then enlighten me. The actor hesitated desperately. Finally, he whispered, he told me she was dead. Holmes became perfectly still. She? He said quietly. Corbyn stared at him with haunted eyes. Mrs. Bellamy. Chapter 3. The Woman in Grey. For several moments after Corbyn's astonishing declaration, the only sound within the dressing room was the muffled roar of applause from the theatre beyond. Holmes sat utterly motionless. It was one of the peculiarities of my friend's nature that the more deeply a revelation interested him, the quieter he became. A casual observer might even mistake his stillness for indifference. Yet I, who had studied him through so many strange adventures, recognized the dangerous brightness now gathering behind his half-closed eyes. Corbyn, meanwhile, appeared on the verge of collapse. He sank heavily into the chair before the mirror, where the grease paint still clung grotesquely to one cheek, lending him the appearance of a man only half emerged from some theatrical disguise. Holmes spoke at last. You had better begin at the beginning. Corbyn swallowed nervously. I swear to you, gentlemen, I never intended harm. I only wanted answers. Holmes folded his arms. Proceed. The actor drew a shaking breath. I knew Mrs. Bellamy years ago, before her marriage. Bellamy's name was pronounced with unmistakable bitterness. She was called Clara Vane then, an actress. Not famous, but admired. I glanced at Holmes, who gave no visible reaction. She possessed, Corbin continued, a remarkable mind. Read philosophy, languages, history. All manner of things beyond the stage. Most men who courted her wanted only her face. Bellamy admired her intellect. "And you?" asked Holmes quietly. Corbin gave a hollow laugh. "I worshipped her." The confession came with such naked sincerity that even Holmes regarded him more attentively. "She married Bellamy in 1887, Corbin said. "Within a year she vanished entirely from London society. Bellamy claimed her health was delicate. Then suddenly came word of her death." "Did you attend the funeral?" Holmes asked. "No, there was none." "No funeral?" Bellamy said she died abroad in Florence, consumption. Holmes's fingers tapped once against the chair arm. "Interesting." Corbin leaned forward intensely. 3 weeks ago, I saw her. I confess I felt a chill despite the overheated dressing room. "Where?" I demanded. "In Regent Street, evening time." She stepped from a carriage wearing a grey veil. I recognised her instantly. "And she recognised you?" "Yes." "What did she do?" She froze as though terrified. Then she hurried away. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "You followed?" "Of course I followed. Any man would." "And?" "She vanished near Cavendish Lane." Holmes nodded slowly. "Continue." Corbin wiped his brow. "I returned there repeatedly over the following days. Finally I saw Bellamy entering number 7 Caversham Square." "You had not known his address previously?" "No." "And the knocking began shortly afterward?" "Yes." Holmes leaned back. "You hoped to force Bellamy into revealing whether his wife still lived?" Corbin nodded miserably. "But why not confront him directly? Because Bellamy is dangerous." The statement came with startling conviction. Holmes' voice sharpened slightly. "Dangerous in what way?" Corbin hesitated. "I cannot explain fully. But years ago, during Clara's engagement, strange men visited Bellamy. Foreigners, scholars perhaps, or smugglers. There were whispered conversations about manuscripts, ancient relics, hidden collections." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "The Society of the Veiled Serpent," said he softly. Corbin stared. "You know of them?" "A little." The actor shuddered visibly. "Clara once told me Bellamy belonged to some secret brotherhood obsessed with antiquities from the East. She regretted the marriage before it even occurred. And yet she married him. She feared poverty more than unhappiness." Holmes rose and wandered thoughtfully about the dressing room. "You left the note?" Corbin nodded reluctantly. "I wanted him frightened. And the footprints? I made them, with unusual boots." The actor blinked. "How did you know?" "Elementary." Corbin stared in amazement. "I stuffed the soles with cork to deepen the impressions." "Why?" "To seem larger. More threatening." Holmes smiled faintly. "A remarkably theatrical solution." Corbin flushed. "I'm an actor, Mr. Holmes." "Indeed." Holmes stopped abruptly before him. "One further question. Did Mrs. Bellamy speak to you when you saw her?" Corbin's face darkened. "She said only 3 words." "What words?" The actor lowered his voice almost to a whisper. "Do not return." Silence followed. At length Holmes took up his hat. "You have been extremely helpful, Mr. Corbin. Am I to be arrested? For knocking upon doors?" London prisons would overflow. Relief flooded the man's face. "But," Holmes added quietly, "if you attempt independent inquiries again, you may not survive them." Corbin went pale. "You truly believe Bellamy dangerous?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that we are no longer investigating harassment but imprisonment." We departed into the foggy street. The theatre lights glimmered weakly behind us while distant carriage wheels echoed through Holborn like rolling drums. For some minutes Holmes walked in silence. "Well," I ventured at last. "My dear Watson," said he, "our problem has developed beautifully. Beautifully. We now possess a dead woman who may be alive, a husband who lies habitually, an actor, driven by fear, and a secret society devoted to antiquities. The pattern begins at last to emerge. You think Clara Bellamy alive? I think someone desperately wishes us to believe she is dead. But to what purpose?" Holmes hailed a cab. "To conceal something vastly more important than a marriage." He gave the driver Bellamy's address. "You intend returning there tonight?" Immediately. The cab carried us swiftly through the murky streets toward Bayswater. As we approached Caversham Square, I noticed Holmes become increasingly alert. "Observe," said he quietly. A solitary figure stood near the iron railings surrounding the square garden. The man wore a dark overcoat with the collar turned high, and though the fog obscured his features, there was something unmistakably watchful in his posture. "He sees us," murmured Holmes. The figure turned abruptly and disappeared into the mist. Holmes gave a soft exclamation. "Too late." "You recognize him?" "No, yet he recognizes us." Bellamy himself admitted us moments later. He appeared more agitated than before. "You have discovered something," he said instantly. Holmes removed his gloves calmly. "Several things." Bellamy's eyes moved nervously from Holmes to myself. "You spoke with the police? With many people?" Bellamy attempted composure. "I trust Mr. Corbin has been apprehended." Holmes smiled thinly. "On the contrary, I found him most illuminating." For the briefest instant, Bellamy's expression changed. Fear. It vanished almost immediately, but Holmes had seen it, and so had I. "You know Corbin?" Holmes asked suddenly. Bellamy hesitated. "Slightly. He was acquainted with your wife before your marriage." "Yes. You told him she died in Florence." "She did." Holmes' voice remained perfectly mild. "How unfortunate, then, that he encountered her alive 3 weeks ago in Regent Street." Bellamy lurched visibly backward. "You are mad." "Am I? My wife is dead?" Holmes stepped closer. "Then, perhaps, you would kindly explain why no death certificate exists." Bellamy's face became utterly bloodless. For a terrible instant I believed he might faint. Instead, he crossed abruptly toward the decanter upon the sideboard and poured himself brandy with trembling hands. "You have no right." "I possess every right," Holmes interrupted coldly. "When a client deceives me." Bellamy drained the glass. "You do not understand the circumstances. Then enlighten me." The man stood staring into the fire. At last he spoke in a low, exhausted voice. "My wife is alive." Though expected, the admission struck the room with startling force. "You concealed her," said Holmes. "Yes." "Why?" Bellamy gave a bitter laugh. "Because she believes I murdered a man." I stared. "Murdered?" Holmes' expression did not alter. "Whom?" "A scholar named Elias Harker." The name plainly meant nothing to Holmes. Bellamy continued. "Harker belonged to our antiquarian circle years ago. Brilliant man. Obsessive. He became convinced that an ancient manuscript existed somewhere in London. A document of immense historical value." "What document?" "I never learned precisely. Harker guarded his discoveries fanatically. And he died. Yes. How?" Bellamy's voice dropped further. "He vanished during an expedition near Aleppo in 1889. Yet, your wife suspected murder. She overheard an argument between Harker and myself before his departure." "What concerned the argument?" Bellamy hesitated. "A manuscript." Holmes' eyes sharpened instantly. "The same manuscript?" "Yes. And did it exist?" Bellamy looked away. "I believe so." Holmes moved silently toward the bookshelf I had earlier seen him examining. "You searched these shelves yesterday," said he. Bellamy stiffened. "Yes." "You were seeking the manuscript?" "No." Holmes suddenly seized a volume from the shelf. A small packet slipped from behind the books and struck the carpet. Bellamy uttered a strangled cry. Holmes stooped swiftly. The packet proved to be a bundle of old papers tied carefully with faded blue ribbon. Holmes untied them. Inside lay several yellowed pages covered in dense, unfamiliar writing. "What language?" I asked. Holmes examined the script closely. "Syriac," said he softly. Bellamy collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "It has begun again," he whispered. Holmes looked up sharply. "What has begun?" Bellamy raised haunted eyes toward him. "They know the manuscript is here." At that very instant, somewhere above us in the darkened house, a floorboard creaked distinctly. All three of us froze. Then came another sound. Not from outside, from within the house itself. 3 slow knocks. Chapter 4. Footsteps above the study. The sound was unmistakable. 3 measured knocks. Not upon the front door this time, but somewhere above our heads within the silent house itself. Bellamy sprang to his feet with such violence that the chair overturned behind him. My God! Holmes had already extinguished the lamp. The study fell instantly into shadow, illuminated only by the dying glow of the fire. Quiet, he whispered. For several seconds we listened. The entire house seemed suspended in dreadful stillness. Beyond the curtained windows, the fog pressed thickly against the panes, while from above came no further movement. Then very faintly I heard it, a footstep. Slow, careful. Directly overhead, Bellamy clutched my arm. There is someone upstairs. Holmes drew his revolver. Remain here, both of you. My dear Holmes, I began. You will accompany me, Watson. Mr. Bellamy will stay below. Bellamy gave a desperate shake of the head. No, I cannot remain alone. Holmes glanced at him sharply. You fear the intruder? Bellamy's lips trembled. You do not understand what may happen if he finds it. The manuscript. Bellamy said nothing, but the silence itself was answer enough. Holmes relit the lamp, lowering the flame until only a dim circle of yellow light remained. Very well, said he, but stay behind us. Thus armed, we ascended the staircase. I confess there was something peculiarly unnerving in that slow progress through the darkened house. The old boards creaked beneath our tread. Shadows swayed uncertainly along the walls, and from somewhere in the unseen depths of the building came the faint ticking of a clock. Holmes moved soundlessly despite his height, the revolver steady in his hand. At the first landing he paused. Listen. A soft scraping noise reached us from the upper floor. Then silence again. Holmes mounted the remaining stairs swiftly. The corridor above lay empty. Doors stood closed upon either side beneath the wavering lamplight. Bellamy pointed with shaking fingers. My study. The door at the far end stood slightly ajar. Holmes approached it cautiously and pushed it open with the barrel of the revolver. The room beyond was deserted, yet at once we perceived evidence of intrusion. Drawers hung open. Books lay scattered across the carpet. Papers had been flung wildly from the writing desk. Holmes crossed instantly to the window. Open. Rain-speckled fog drifted inward from the square below. He escaped, I cried. Quite recently. Bellamy uttered a low moan. He was searching for the manuscript. Holmes examined the sill carefully. Observe, Watson. Several faint smears marked the woodwork. Mud? No soot. He touched the black substance thoughtfully. Coal soot. Curious. Bellamy moved frantically among the disturbed papers. He has taken nothing. Are you certain? Yes. Holmes' gaze shifted toward the fireplace. Not entirely nothing. I followed his eyes. A single page lay half-burned among the ashes upon the grate. Holmes snatched it up swiftly. The page bore the same strange Syriac script as the manuscript below, though the lower portion had already curled black beneath the flames. He attempted to destroy it, said I. No, Holmes replied quietly. He attempted to read it, Bellamy stared. What do you mean? Holmes held a page near the lamp. The edge is scorched from candle flame, not fire. Someone examined this sheet very closely. He turned suddenly upon Bellamy. How many pages comprise the manuscript? Bellamy hesitated. I am not certain. You have never counted them? No. Holmes' eyes narrowed dangerously. My dear sir, your evasions grow exhausting. Bellamy sank weakly into a chair. I have told you as much as I dare. As you dare? Bellamy looked toward the open window. You do not know the men involved. Holmes closed the window firmly. Then educate me. For a long moment Bellamy remained silent. At last he spoke. The manuscript came into Harker's possession during excavations in Syria. It was hidden within a ruined monastery near Aleppo. Holmes listened intently. Harker believed it enormously valuable. Not financially, but politically. Politically, I repeated. Yes. Bellamy drew a hand across his brow. The document contained records dating back centuries, names, transactions, secret agreements between influential European families and certain Ottoman officials. Holmes' expression sharpened. Blackmail material. In a sense. And where is the remainder of the manuscript? Bellamy gave a weary laugh. That is precisely the problem, Mr. Holmes. Harker divided it before his disappearance. Holmes became perfectly still. Divided? Yes, into 3 sections. And you possess one? Bellamy nodded miserably. What of the others? One vanished with Harker. The second, he hesitated. Yes? I believe my wife took it. A silence followed. Holmes turned slowly away. Now, said he, we begin at last to approach the truth. Suddenly footsteps sounded below, rapid footsteps. Then Mrs. Graves' frightened voice echoed up the staircase. Mr. Bellamy, sir. Bellamy hurried to the landing. What is it? The old housekeeper stood below, wringing her hands in terror. There's a gentleman asking for you. At this hour? He says it concerns Mrs. Bellamy. Bellamy gave a strangled gasp. Holmes descended instantly. In the study? Yes, sir. We followed him downstairs. The study door stood partly open, and silhouetted against the firelight I perceived the figure of a tall man in a dark overcoat. As we entered, he removed his hat calmly. He was perhaps 50 years of age, broad-shouldered, with silvered hair and an angular military face deeply lined about the mouth. A trimmed beard concealed the lower portion of his features, yet his pale eyes possessed extraordinary force. The stranger bowed slightly. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume? Holmes regarded him coolly. You possess the advantage of me. My name is Lionel Moberly. Bellamy recoiled as though struck. You! The newcomer ignored him entirely. I regret the late intrusion, said he, but the matter admits no further delay. Holmes motioned toward a chair. You are the gentleman who sought investment funds from Mr. Bellamy. Moberly smiled faintly. That was merely our final disagreement. You know of the nightly disturbances? Intimately. Holmes lit a cigarette. Then perhaps you are responsible, partially. Bellamy stared in outrage. You villain! Moberly turned upon him with sudden cold fury. Be silent, Bellamy. Your lies have already cost one life. The room became utterly still. Holmes' eyes glinted. Harker? Moberly inclined his head. You move rapidly, Mr. Holmes. You imply Bellamy murdered him. I imply nothing. I state it. Bellamy surged forward. That is false. Moberly ignored him. I warned Harker repeatedly not to trust this man. He desired the manuscript for himself. Holmes exhaled smoke thoughtfully. And did he obtain it? No. Then who did? Moberly hesitated. That, said he quietly, is the true danger. Holmes leaned forward. You know where Mrs. Bellamy is? Moberly's face altered slightly. Yes. Alive? Yes. Bellamy uttered a broken cry. Clara! Moberly turned toward him with unmistakable contempt. She will never return to you. Bellamy collapsed heavily into the chair beside the fire. Holmes studied Moberly carefully. You have concealed her these 6 years. For her protection. From whom? Moberly's answer came instantly. From the men who killed Harker. Holmes' eyes flashed. You saw the murder? No, but I saw its aftermath. And these men now seek the manuscript. Yes. How many? I know of 3 names. I possess none. Holmes tapped ash delicately into the grate. Yet you participate in the harassment of Bellamy. I sought to force him into surrendering the document. Why not inform the police? Moberly smiled grimly. Because the police cannot protect him. The words carried such conviction that even I felt a chill. Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. You are afraid. For the first time in my life. A silence followed. Then Holmes spoke very softly. What exactly is contained in the missing portion of the manuscript? Moberly's jaw tightened. The location. The location of what? The man looked directly into Holmes' eyes. A collection. What collection? Moberly lowered his voice. One worth killing for. At that precise instant the front bell rang violently through the house. Everyone started. Mrs. Graves hurried trembling toward the hall. A moment later we heard raised voices, then hurried footsteps. Lestrade burst into the study, flushed with excitement and rain upon his coat. Mr. Holmes? He halted abruptly upon seeing Moberly. Well, said Holmes dryly, the cast assembles admirably. Lestrade pointed dramatically toward Moberly. That's the man. Moberly rose slowly. What man? The fellow from the square. We've been tracking him all evening. Holmes' gaze sharpened instantly. Indeed, Lestrade nodded vigorously. One of my constables followed him from Paddington. The man met with a known foreign criminal 2 hours ago. Moberly's face darkened. You had me followed. Quite right too, snapped Lestrade. And there's more. He turned toward Holmes. A body's been found. The word struck the room like a pistol shot. Where? Holmes demanded. In Cavendish Lane. Lestrade swallowed hard. A woman's body. Chapter V. The dead woman of Cavendish Lane. No one in that room shall ever forget the effect produced by Lestrade's announcement. Bellamy gave a choking gasp and clutched at the edge of the table, as though his strength had suddenly abandoned him. Moberly's stern face hardened into something grim and dangerous, while Holmes alone remained outwardly composed. Yet I, who knew him intimately, saw the quick contraction of his eyelids and the sudden stillness of his fingers upon the cigarette ash. "A woman," he repeated quietly. Lestrade nodded. "Found less than 20 minutes ago, behind a warehouse in Cavendish Lane. My men thought it best to notify you immediately, given the circumstances." Holmes rose at once. "Describe her. Middle-aged, perhaps. Dark hair, grey travelling cloak." Bellamy uttered a cry of anguish. "Clara." Moberly seized him sharply by the arm. "Control yourself, fool." Holmes turned instantly. "You believe it may indeed be Mrs. Bellamy?" Moberly's expression was unreadable. "I fear it." Lestrade looked bewildered. "Mrs. Bellamy? I thought the lady dead these 6 years." "So did several people," Holmes replied dryly. "Come, Watson, we waste time." Within minutes we were once more out in the night. The fog had thickened to an oppressive yellow-grey curtain, through which the gas lamps shone dimly like distant moons. Lestrade's cab rattled furiously eastward, while Bellamy and Moberly sat opposite one another in utter silence. Never have I ridden in a vehicle so burdened by tension. Bellamy's face had collapsed into dreadful pallor, and from time to time his hands twitched convulsively upon his knees. Moberly, by contrast, appeared carved from stone, though beneath his cold composure there smouldered unmistakable anxiety. Holmes sat beside me with closed eyes. Only once did he speak. "To discover a body precisely when discussion approaches truth," said he softly, "is rarely coincidence." No one answered. Cavendish Lane proved a narrow industrial passage, running between warehouses near the river. Police lanterns flickered through the mist ahead, casting strange, distorted shadows upon the wet cobblestones. A constable admitted us beneath the cordon. The body lay partly sheltered beneath an archway. It was covered by a tarpaulin. Lestrade removed his hat grimly. "Found by a night watchman." Bellamy moved forward unsteadily. Holmes stopped him with a raised hand. "One moment." He knelt beside the body and lifted the edge of the covering. I heard him inhale sharply. Then he replaced it immediately and rose. "Well," demanded Lestrade. "It is not Mrs. Bellamy." Bellamy staggered backward in visible relief. "Thank God! Who is she?" I asked. Holmes glanced toward the body once more. "A woman of approximately 50 years. Poorly nourished, recently deceased." "Cause of death?" Holmes pointed toward the throat. A dark bruise marked the skin just beneath the jaw. "Manual strangulation." Lestrade muttered an oath. "Murder, then, unquestionably." The inspector frowned. "But what has she to do with Bellamy?" Holmes crouched again beside the corpse. "Observe the hand." The dead woman's fingers clutched a scrap of grey cloth. Holmes examined it carefully. "From a gentleman's coat sleeve," said he. "Could belong to anyone," Lestrade protested. "Perhaps." Holmes' gaze moved suddenly toward the alley entrance. "Who found the body?" "The watchman. Fellow named Pierce." "Where is he?" A stooped labourer emerged nervously from the shadows, twisting his cap between roughened hands. Holmes approached him at once. "You discovered the woman?" "Yes, sir. At what time?" "Little after 11. "Was she alone?" Pierce hesitated. I heard voices first." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "How many?" "2 men and a woman." "What were they saying?" "Couldn't rightly hear. They was arguing." "Then?" "There came a scream." Bellamy visibly shuddered, and afterward, Pierce swallowed. "I saw a tall gent hurry off toward the river." "Describe him." "Dark coat, beard maybe. Hard to say in the fog." Lestrade glanced triumphantly toward Moberly. "There now." Moberly gave him a contemptuous look. "You describe half the men in London." Holmes ignored them both. "What of the woman?" "She stumbled under the arch, then fell." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Did you recognize her?" "No, sir." Holmes turned back to the body once more. Then suddenly his expression altered. "Ah, what is it?" I asked. He pointed toward the dead woman's boots. One heel had been repaired with a curious triangular brass plate. Holmes became intensely alert. Most remarkable. Lestrade frowned impatiently. A cobbler's repair excites you. Profoundly. He rose swiftly. Watson, come with me. Where? To the river. Without another word, he strode from the alley into the fog. I hurried after him while behind us. Lestrade called irritably, Holmes, where the devil are you going? Holmes did not answer. We moved rapidly through twisting streets toward the Thames embankment. At last, beneath the looming shadow of Blackfriars Wharf, Holmes halted abruptly. What exactly are we seeking? I asked breathlessly. A boat. A boat? Yes. He pointed toward the muddy river stairs descending into darkness. Observe the marks. Lantern light revealed deep grooves upon the wet stone. Recent, I asked. Within the hour. Holmes crouched low, and there, a fragment of rope fibre clung to the iron mooring ring. Holmes touched it delicately. Tarred marine cordage. I confess my bewilderment deepened. You think the murderer escaped by water? I think, Holmes replied, that our dead woman came here intentionally. Why? Holmes straightened slowly. Because the brass heel repair is common among dock labourers and river people. She belonged near the wharves. Then why was she killed? That, said Holmes softly, depends entirely upon what she carried. We searched the surrounding embankment for nearly 20 minutes before. Holmes abruptly stopped beside a stack of cargo crates. Half hidden beneath the timber lay a woman's handbag. Holmes picked it up carefully. Inside we found several coins, a handkerchief, and a folded envelope. Holmes opened it beneath the lantern. The paper contained only an address, 7 Caversham Square, and beneath it, in hurried handwriting, he has begun the knocking again. Tell her not to trust the man with the scar. Holmes' expression became very grave indeed. The man with the scar, I repeated. Moberly, possibly. But who wrote the message? The dead woman, I suspect. And her refers to Mrs. Bellamy? Holmes folded the paper thoughtfully. Yes. A terrible idea struck me suddenly. Holmes, what if Mrs. Bellamy truly is alive and hiding nearby? My dear Watson, said he quietly, I should now consider that nearly certain. At that moment footsteps approached through the fog. We turned sharply. A young constable emerged breathlessly. Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade says to return at once. What has happened? The constable swallowed nervously. There's been another attack. Holmes' eyes flashed. Where? Caversham Square. We raced back through the sleeping streets with all possible speed. By the time we reached number 7, police lanterns already glimmered outside the house. Lestrade met us at the door, flushed and furious. He escaped by seconds. Who? The intruder. Bellamy's servant, Mrs. Graves, sat sobbing in the hall while a constable attempted unsuccessfully to calm her. Holmes entered the study swiftly. The room had been ransacked. Books lay scattered everywhere. Drawers torn open. The manuscript pages missing from the desk. Bellamy himself sat slumped in an armchair, with blood running from a cut above his temple. Moberly stood beside him, grim-faced and breathing heavily. What occurred? Demanded Holmes. Moberly answered. The lights failed. All of them? Yes, the house went dark. Then someone entered through the rear passage. Lestrade snorted angrily. Professional work. Bellamy looked up weakly. He struck me from behind. And the manuscript? Holmes asked. Gone. A silence followed. Holmes surveyed the devastated room carefully. Then his gaze fell upon the hearth. There, propped neatly against the grate, stood a single sheet of paper. Holmes lifted it. Upon the page appeared the now familiar handwriting. The second part is mine. Below the message had been drawn the same symbol as upon the ivory button. The coiled serpent. Holmes stared at it for several seconds. Then, to my astonishment, he began to laugh softly. Lestrade gaped. Have you gone mad? Holmes handed him the paper. On the contrary, my dear Lestrade, our adversary has finally made his first genuine mistake. What mistake? Holmes pointed toward the serpent symbol. This ink, said he quietly, was written by a left-handed man. Moberly stiffened instantly, and for the first time since entering the room, I noticed the long pale scar running across the back of his left hand, chapped to fig. The scar upon the left hand. The atmosphere within the ruined study became instantly electric. Lestrade turned sharply toward Moberly. "You there?" The former adventurer did not move. He stood beside the fire with arms folded, his pale eyes fixed steadily upon Holmes. "A clever observation," said he quietly. Bellamy stared upward in horror. "You?" Lestrade stepped forward aggressively. "Mr. Holmes believes you wrote this message." Moberly's lip curled faintly. "Does he indeed?" Holmes leaned lazily against the mantelpiece, though I detected beneath his apparent calm the intense alertness of a hunting hound. "I observe only facts," said he. "The downward pressure of the strokes, the direction of the ink drag, the slight smearing at the edge. All indicate left-handed authorship." Lestrade pointed triumphantly at the scar, and the fellow's left hand bears a mark exactly matching the description in the warning note. Bellamy rose unsteadily. "My God, it was you all along." Moberly gave a low, contemptuous laugh. "You overestimate yourselves." "Do I?" Holmes asked softly. Without warning, Moberly thrust a hand into his coat. Lestrade shouted and reached for his revolver, but Holmes remained perfectly still. The adventurer slowly withdrew, not a weapon, but a leather cigar case. "Really, gentlemen," said he dryly, selecting a cigar, "your nerves do you little credit." Lestrade flushed furiously. Holmes' eyes, however, never left the man's face. "You anticipated suspicion eventually falling upon you." "Of course." "Then why remain?" Moberly lit the cigar calmly. "Because if I intended murder, Mr. Holmes, Bellamy would already be dead." The statement carried such cold certainty that even Lestrade hesitated. Holmes spoke again. "You admit involvement in the theft?" "I admit nothing." "And yet the manuscript vanished while you alone remained armed and composed during the attack." Moberly smiled thinly. "Surely your celebrated logic can produce stronger evidence." Holmes crossed slowly toward the shattered desk. "Possibly." He picked up the extinguished oil lamp from the floor. "Interesting." "What now?" Lestrade demanded irritably. Holmes held the lamp toward the light. "The wick has been cut. And very neatly." He looked toward Moberly. "A sailor's habit, perhaps? Or military?" Moberly exhaled smoke without answering. Holmes set down the lamp. "My dear Lestrade, before you arrest anyone, kindly tell me one thing." "What?" "Who extinguished the street lamps outside number 7 tonight?" Lestrade blinked. "The street, yes, Mrs. Graves stated the entire square became dark moments before the intrusion." "So?" Holmes' voice sharpened. "So gas lamps are not extinguished accidentally one by one." Moberly's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Holmes continued. "Therefore at least one accomplice operated outside the house while another entered within." Lestrade frowned uncertainly. "You mean there were 2 men?" "At minimum." Bellamy sank back into his chair with a groan. "It never ends." Holmes turned upon him suddenly. "No, Mr. Bellamy, it has scarcely begun." The intensity of his tone startled even me. Holmes moved swiftly across the room. "You concealed the manuscript for 6 years. During that time at least 3 people died or disappeared because of it. Now a woman has been strangled in the streets of London. How many more victims shall accumulate before you speak plainly?" Bellamy covered his face weakly. "I have told you everything." "No." Holmes' voice became cold as ice. "You have told us fragments. You still conceal the central truth." Bellamy looked up miserably. "What truth?" Holmes stepped closer. "The true nature of the collection." A silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Moberly spoke. "He does not know." Holmes turned sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean," said Moberly quietly, "that Harker never trusted Bellamy fully. You said the manuscript revealed a location." "Yes." "The location of what?" Moberly removed the cigar from his lips. "A hidden archive." "Archive?" "Documents, letters, financial records, diplomatic correspondence gathered across centuries." Holmes' expression sharpened. "Political blackmail." "Potentially catastrophic blackmail." Bellamy stared at him. "You told me it was merely historical material." Moberly laughed harshly. "You believed that, because you wished to." Holmes folded his arms thoughtfully. "Who assembled the archive? No one knows. Some say Ottoman officials. Others claim Venetian merchants. There are stories connecting it to old intelligence networks operating during the Napoleonic period, and the missing sections of the manuscript reveal its location. So Harker believed. Holmes paced slowly before the fire, one section with Bellamy, one with Mrs. Bellamy, and the third, Moberly's expression darkened, lost after Harker's death. Lost or stolen? The man hesitated. Possibly stolen. Holmes stopped abruptly. By whom? Before Moberly could answer, a constable entered hurriedly. Inspector. Lestrade wheeled about. What now? The cabman from earlier's been found. What cabman? The one who drove near Cavendish Lane tonight. Lestrade cursed softly. Well, he's unconscious, sir. Holmes' eyes flashed instantly. Where? 2 streets over, struck from behind. Alive? Yes, sir, barely. Holmes seized his coat. Watson. Within minutes, we were following the constable through the fog-drenched streets toward a narrow mews behind the river warehouses. The cabman had been carried into a stable office where a physician now attended him. He proved a burly fellow, with blood matted through his hair. The doctor looked up as we entered. Concussion. Severe but not fatal. Holmes bent immediately beside the injured man. Can he speak? Briefly, perhaps. Holmes leaned close. You drove a passenger from Cavendish Lane tonight. The cabman groaned faintly. Yes. A man? Yes. Describe him. Tall, foreign accent. Holmes' eyes sharpened. Where did you take him? The man swallowed painfully. King's Cross. Station? Yes. Then what happened? He paid me. Then another gent climbed aboard. Another. Never saw him come. The cabman shuddered. Something hit me. Holmes glanced quickly toward Lestrade. Did you hear the second man speak? The injured fellow nodded weakly. One word. What word? The cabman's lips trembled. Seraph. Holmes became perfectly still. Are you certain? Yes. The man slipped unconscious once more. Lestrade scratched his head irritably. Seraph? What the devil does that mean? Holmes did not answer. Instead he turned abruptly toward the physician. Will he survive? Almost certainly. Good. Holmes stepped outside into the fog. I followed him immediately. Well? I demanded. Holmes stood silent beneath the dripping eaves of the stable yard. At last he said quietly, The game changes again. You know the word? Yes. What does it mean? Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his cigarette. Not what, who. You mean a person? A title, perhaps, or code name. For whom? Holmes looked toward the distant river lights. For the man directing all this. A gust of damp wind swept through the alley. Somewhere nearby a church bell tolled midnight. Holmes, said I, you appear genuinely disturbed. My dear Watson, whenever intelligent criminals employ organisation instead of impulse, one should become disturbed. He began walking slowly back, toward the main road. The extinguished lamps, coordinated movements, silent pursuit, coded names. This is not the work of common thieves. You think some larger group involved? I am now nearly certain of it. We had gone perhaps 50 yards, when Holmes suddenly halted so abruptly that I nearly collided with him. What is it? He pointed silently downward. Upon the wet pavement near the curb lay a small object glimmering beneath the gaslight. Holmes picked it up delicately. It was another ivory button, but this one differed subtly from the first. Instead of the serpent symbol, a single word had been carved upon its surface. Sir Holmes stared at it for several moments. Then he slipped it into his pocket with unusual care. Come, Watson, you have formed a conclusion. Only a preliminary one. And Holmes' voice became very soft. Our unknown enemy is no longer warning Bellamy. Then, whom? He looked back once toward the dark maze of streets behind us. Sius, Chapter 7. Holmes vanishes. I have often remarked upon the curious effect danger produced upon Sherlock Holmes. Ordinary men, confronted by mounting peril, either grow reckless or cautious. Holmes became animated. The very presence of an adversary worthy of his intellect seemed to sharpen every faculty within him, until he resembled some finely tempered instrument vibrating beneath invisible pressure. Yet on the morning following the discovery of the second ivory button, I observed in him something rarer still. Uneasiness. Not fear, never fear, but a deep and watchful concentration unlike his usual cold confidence. He spent the greater part of the night pacing our sitting room at Baker Street while London slept beneath ceaseless rain. The fire had burned low, the lamps flickered weakly through tobacco haze, and still Holmes moved restlessly between mantelpiece and window. At last, near dawn, he halted before me. "Watson, tell me honestly, what impression has Moberly made upon you?" The abruptness of the question surprised me. "He strikes me as dangerous," said I, "but perhaps not dishonest." Holmes nodded faintly. "Precisely. You believe him truthful. I believe him selective." Holmes drew the ivory button from his pocket and turned it thoughtfully between his fingers. "The word seraph troubles me profoundly." "Why?" "Because it implies hierarchy." I stared. "Hiki?" "Yes. Secret societies, criminal fraternities, intelligence networks. All adopt titles, symbols, ranks. The serpent insignia already suggested organization. But this," he tapped the button lightly, "this implies command. You think Seraph is the leader, or executioner," he resumed pacing. "At present we possess 3 separate yet connected mysteries. The disappearance of Elias Harker, the concealed survival of Mrs. Bellamy, and the hidden archive, sought through these manuscript fragments. And behind them all?" Holmes' expression hardened. "An intelligence far more disciplined than Bellamy, Corbin, or even Moberly." He abruptly seized his violin and drew from it a series of low, discordant notes which echoed strangely through the room. "You know," said he suddenly, "what most defeats the average investigator?" "What?" "The assumption that criminals are necessarily vulgar." He laid aside the instrument again. "The greatest conspiracies are invariably conducted by educated men." At 9 o'clock Lestrade arrived. The inspector appeared exhausted and irritable. "We've searched Moberly's hotel," he announced without preamble. "Nothing." Holmes remained lounging upon the sofa with closed eyes. "No documents?" "No. No weapons? Only a revolver. Unused?" "Yes." Holmes nodded slightly. "Then Moberly expected danger, but not confrontation." Lestrade removed his gloves impatiently. "I'm growing tired of riddles, Mr. Holmes. Are we pursuing murderers or chasing ghosts?" Holmes opened one eye. "Both, perhaps," the inspector snorted. "There's another matter. We identified the dead woman from Cavendish Lane." "Oh?" "Name of Martha Pike, washerwoman. Lived near Wapping." Holmes sat upright instantly. "Wapping?" "Yes. Know the place?" "Intimately." Holmes crossed swiftly to the map cabinet and withdrew a large street chart of eastern London. "Where exactly?" Lestrade pointed. "An alley near Old Gravel Wharf." Holmes bent over the map in silence. Then suddenly he smiled. "There you are." "What now?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes tapped the map. "Observe these locations, Watson." He marked 3 points: Cavendish Lane, Blackfriars Wharf, Old Gravel Wharf. "They form a line," said I. "Exactly." Lestrade looked unimpressed. "So?" "So our enemy moves systematically along the river." Holmes' finger travelled farther east. "And here lies Limehouse." The name carried unpleasant associations even to my own ears. That district beside the docks had long been notorious for opium dens, smuggling houses, and the strange cosmopolitan criminality produced by London's maritime trade. "You suspect Limehouse involved?" I asked. "I suspect," Holmes replied quietly, "that Harker's archive entered England by water." Lestrade frowned. "You mean smuggling?" "Most likely." At that moment Holmes' expression altered sharply. He strode to the window. "Too late." "What is it?" A small boy stood below in Baker Street holding an envelope. Mrs. Hudson admitted him moments later. "For Mr. Holmes, sir." Holmes took the note and dismissed the lad with a coin. The message consisted of only one sentence. "If you seek the woman, come alone to Shadwell Stairs at midnight." No signature appeared. Lestrade cursed softly. "A trap." "Obviously," said Holmes. "You can't intend going." Holmes folded the note carefully. "On the contrary, I must. You'll be murdered. Possibly." Lestrade turned toward me in exasperation. "Talk sense into him, Doctor." But I already knew the futility of such attempts. Once Holmes detected the scent of truth, danger merely increased his determination. The remainder of the day passed in preparation. Holmes dispatched telegrams, consulted shipping records, and spent nearly an hour disguised as a ragged dock labourer before vanishing into the East End. He returned shortly before evening, covered in grime and smelling strongly of river fog. "Well," I asked eagerly, "interesting developments?" "Such as, Martha Pike worked occasionally for a riverside warehouse leased under a false company name." "Owned by whom?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That, Watson, is the interesting point. The ownership traces ultimately to a dead man. Impossible." "My dear fellow, London commerce thrives upon impossible ownership." He sat down to a sparse supper with unusual absent-mindedness. At 11 o'clock he rose and put on his overcoat. "You remain here." "I shall do no such thing." "Watson." "My dear Holmes," said I firmly, "you once remarked that I possessed at least the virtue of loyalty. Permit me now to exercise it." For an instant his severe expression softened. "Very well." We departed together through the fog-bound streets. A damp wind blew from the river, carrying the smell of coal smoke and mud. By the time we reached Shadwell, the city had grown unnaturally silent. The river stairs descended steeply between rotting warehouses into black water, glimmering faintly beneath the gas lamps. No one appeared visible. Holmes stopped halfway down the steps. "Careful." A shape moved suddenly in the darkness below. Then a woman emerged. She wore a grey travelling cloak, with the hood drawn low over her face. Bellamy's wife. Even before Holmes spoke, I knew it instinctively. She halted several feet away. "You came." Her voice was low and cultured, touched by exhaustion. Holmes removed his hat slightly. "Mrs. Bellamy, I presume." She lowered the veil. The face revealed beneath was pale and strained, yet unmistakably beautiful even after years of concealment. Her dark eyes moved anxiously over the shadows surrounding us. "You should not have brought your friend." Holmes smiled faintly. "Dr. Watson is indispensable." She stepped closer. "You are in terrible danger, Mr. Holmes. That has frequently been observed. This is not a jest." Holmes' expression sharpened instantly. "You sent the note?" "Yes." "Then speak quickly." She looked behind her nervously. "They know Bellamy still possesses part of the manuscript." "And you possess another?" "Yes." "Where? I cannot tell you yet." Holmes studied her intently. "You feared your husband. I feared what he became. Did he murder Elias Harker?" Her face tightened painfully. "I do not know. That is not an answer." "No." She drew a trembling breath. "But I know Bellamy betrayed him." Holmes glanced toward the river. "To whom?" Before she could answer, a whistle shrilled suddenly through the fog. Mrs. Bellamy went white. "They've found me." Holmes seized her arm. "Who?" But at that instant figures emerged from the mist above the stairs. 3 men, all cloaked in dark coats. One carried a lantern whose beam flashed briefly across a revolver barrel. "Down!" Holmes cried. A shot exploded through the night. The bullet shattered stone inches above my head. Holmes hurled Mrs. Bellamy behind the stair wall while drawing his own revolver. Another shot rang out. Then chaos erupted. The lantern crashed to the ground. Fog swirled violently as shadowy figures rushed downward. I heard Holmes shout something lost beneath the thunder of feet and gunfire. One attacker lunged toward me from the darkness. I struck instinctively with my cane, felt the man stagger, then heard him plunge sideways into the water below with a terrible splash. Simultaneously, Holmes fired once. A cry answered from the fog, then silence. The remaining assailants vanished as swiftly as they had appeared. For several seconds only the river moved beneath us, black and restless against the stone steps. Holmes lowered his revolver slowly. "Watson?" "I am unhurt." "Mrs. Bellamy?" No answer came. Holmes wheeled instantly. The place where she had crouched behind the wall stood empty. "She's gone!" I cried. Holmes' face became grim. He bent suddenly toward the ground. There, gleaming faintly beside the whetstones, lay a small silver locket. Holmes opened it. Inside rested the miniature portrait of a bearded man I had never seen before. Beneath it, folded carefully into the locket's lining, was a scrap of paper containing 3 words. "Trust no one." Holmes stared at the message in silence. Then, very softly, he said, "They have taken her again." But it was not until we reached Baker Street near dawn that the true shock awaited us. Mrs. Hudson met us trembling at the door. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, what is it?" "There was a gentleman here, sir. Foreign-looking he was. Asked for you." Holmes became instantly alert. "When?" "Less than an hour ago." And Mrs. Hudson wrung her hands. He left this. She handed Holmes an envelope. Inside was a single sheet. I saw Holmes's face harden as he read. "What is it?" I demanded. Without a word, he handed me the note. It contained only one sentence. "Sherlock Holmes must disappear now, or Dr. Watson dies next." Chapter 8. The empty room at Baker Street. There are moments in life when the atmosphere of a room alters so completely that one feels, with almost physical certainty, the crossing of some invisible threshold. Such a moment occurred when I finished reading the note. The words themselves were brief, almost absurdly simple, yet the menace underlying them struck far deeper than any theatrical threat. The paper bore no signature, no flourish of rhetoric, no attempt at intimidation, beyond the cold clarity of the message itself. Sherlock Holmes must disappear now, or Dr. Watson dies next. I looked up sharply. Holmes stood beside the fire with the note between his fingers, his face utterly expressionless. Mrs. Hudson hovered anxiously near the doorway. "Oh, sir," she whispered. "Surely you don't think—" Holmes interrupted gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. Kindly lock the doors and admit no one." The good woman withdrew reluctantly. The moment she vanished, I turned upon my friend. "This has gone far enough." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Indeed? You cannot seriously consider yielding to blackmail." "My dear Watson, blackmail implies negotiation. This is strategy. Then let us answer strategically, with police protection." Holmes smiled faintly. "You overestimate the practical usefulness of Scotland Yard." "Holmes!" He seated himself calmly and lit a cigarette. "Consider the position logically. Our opponents possess surveillance sufficient to monitor Baker Street, enough organisation to coordinate attacks across London, and sufficient confidence to threaten you directly. You speak as though admiring them. I admire competence wherever it appears. I confess my temper rose. You may treat the affair as an intellectual exercise if you please. But I do not relish serving as bait." Holmes' eyes softened slightly. "My dear fellow, if I believed your danger unavoidable, I should never have permitted your involvement. That is little comfort." "No," said he quietly, "it is not." For several moments he sat, smoking in silence. Then suddenly he rose. "You must leave London." I stared at him. "Absolutely not." "Watson, I refuse." Holmes crossed to the window and peered cautiously through the curtains into the pale dawn. "You mistake stubbornness for courage. And you mistake secrecy for wisdom?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Perhaps." He turned back toward me. "Very well. Since you insist upon remaining, you shall at least know the truth as far as I presently understand it." I sat down instantly. Holmes resumed his place opposite me. Elias Harker discovered more than a manuscript in Syria. The archive? Yes, or rather evidence leading toward it. And Bellamy betrayed him. I now consider that certain. Holmes steepled his fingers. Harker belonged originally to a circle of antiquarian scholars operating across Europe and Constantinople. They trafficked not merely in relics, but in information. Spies, in effect. Holmes rose again restlessly. Empires survive through secrets, Watson. Treaties, debts, scandals, private correspondence. Such materials possess greater value than gold. And the archive contains these? So it appears. I considered this. But why pursue it now after so many years? Holmes stopped before the mantelpiece. Because someone recently learned its location. The realization struck me instantly. The missing third section. Exactly. Holmes nodded approvingly. You perceive the essential point. For years, the fragments remained scattered. Then suddenly one fragment resurfaces. Hence the murders. Precisely. I leaned forward. Who possesses the third section? Holmes' face darkened. That is the question upon which everything now depends. A sharp knock sounded below. Both of us stiffened immediately. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted upward. A telegram for Dr. Watson's? Holmes moved swiftly to the door. The telegram proved from my old colleague Stamford at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Urgent. Please come immediately arranging former patient. Holmes examined the message carefully. You expected this? Certainly not. Curious. You suspect a trap? My dear Watson, said Holmes dryly, I now suspect traps in my breakfast tea. Nevertheless, he insisted upon accompanying me. The morning streets were crowded despite the lingering fog, and several times I noticed Holmes glance sharply behind us, as though searching for followers. At St. Bartholomew's we found Stamford waiting near the surgical ward. You came quickly, said he. What is the matter? A woman asking for you. For me? Yes. She refused to give her name. Holmes's eyes narrowed instantly. Where is she? Stamford pointed toward a private examination room. She appeared extremely distressed. Holmes and I exchanged a glance before entering cautiously. The woman waiting inside rose abruptly. To my astonishment, it was Mrs. Bellamy. Her grey cloak was soaked with rain, and dark circles shadowed her exhausted eyes. Thank heaven, she whispered. I feared they had reached you first. Holmes closed the door immediately. You escaped. Barely. How? One of the men fell into the river during the attack. In the confusion I ran, Holmes studied her sharply. You came here because, she looked toward me. Because, Doctor, Watson was once an army surgeon. I could confess my bewilderment deepened. You are injured? Not I, she hesitated. There is someone else. Holmes' expression hardened. Whom? A man hidden near Limehouse. He was wounded last night. One of the attackers? No. Then who? Mrs. Bellamy drew a trembling breath. The man from the locket. Holmes became perfectly still. You know him. Name? She lowered her voice. Gabriel Vale. The name plainly affected Holmes. Ah. You recognize it. I encountered references yesterday in shipping records. Mrs. Bellamy nodded weakly. He was once Harker's partner, and now he is dying. Holmes stepped closer instantly. You are certain? Yes. Where is he? She hesitated. If I tell you, you must promise protection. Holmes' voice became cold. Madam, protection grows increasingly theoretical. Yet after a moment he added more gently. You have my word, Mrs. Bellamy gave the address of an abandoned riverside lodging house near Limehouse Reach. Holmes' eyes flashed with sudden urgency. We go immediately. Within the hour we had crossed into the East End. The district through which we passed seemed another world, entirely from the respectable squares of Western London. Narrow alleys twisted between leaning brick buildings, blackened by soot and damp, sailors, dock labourers, and pale-faced foreigners drifted through the mist, while somewhere unseen ships' bells tolled along the river. The lodging-house stood isolated beside a decaying warehouse. Holmes halted before entering. Careful. The front door hung partly open. Inside, the building smelled of mildew and stale smoke. We ascended cautiously to the second floor where Mrs. Bellamy led us into a cramped chamber overlooking the river. A man lay upon the bed. He was perhaps 60 years of age, gaunt almost to emaciation, with a heavy beard, streaked white and deeply sunken eyes. One shoulder had been bandaged hastily, and blood stained the mattress beneath him. At our entrance he struggled upright weakly. Holmes? His voice was barely audible. Holmes moved swiftly beside the bed. You know me? I knew your reputation. The wounded man coughed painfully. Too late, perhaps. You are Gabriel Vale. Yes. Holmes examined the wound rapidly. Bullet passed through cleanly. Watson? I took over immediately, while Holmes questioned the man. You were present at Shadwell Stairs? Vale nodded faintly. I tried to stop them. The attackers? Yes. Who are they? Vale's fevered eyes flickered toward Mrs. Bellamy. They belong to him. To whom? Vale's lips trembled. The Seraph. Holmes leaned closer. Name him. The old man gave a weak laugh. If I knew his true name, I'd already be dead. Holmes' face darkened. You served him once? Yes. In what capacity? Vale closed his eyes briefly. We searched for the archive together. A silence followed. Then Holmes spoke softly. And you found it? Vale opened his eyes again. No. Then why all this killing? The old man looked toward the rain-streaked window. Because Harker lied. Holmes became utterly still. What do you mean? Harker never possessed the location. Mrs. Bellamy gasped softly. But the manuscript was incomplete. Holmes' voice sharpened instantly. Then what reveals the archive? Vale coughed violently before answering. A cipher. Where? Vale stared directly at Holmes, hidden inside the manuscript itself. Holmes' eyes flashed. The Syriac text is encoded. Yes. By whom? Harker. The old man's breathing became increasingly laboured. He feared the seraph would kill him. And Bellamy? Bellamy betrayed everyone. Holmes glanced quickly toward Mrs. Bellamy. You knew this? Tears welled suddenly in her eyes. I suspected. Vale struggled weakly upward. Listen carefully, Holmes. His voice dropped to a whisper. The seraph already has the third fragment. Holmes stiffened. Then why pursue the others? Because each section contains part of the cipher. Without all three, the archive remains hidden. Suddenly footsteps sounded below. Heavy footsteps. Holmes wheeled toward the door instantly. Too late. The footsteps multiplied rapidly. Not one man, several. Mrs. Bellamy went white with terror. They followed me. Holmes drew his revolver. Watson, bar the door. I shoved the bolt across just as voices echoed up the staircase. Then came 3 slow knocks. The same terrible knocking, measured, deliberate. Close beyond the door, a voice spoke quietly from the corridor. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes' face hardened. We are occupied. The unseen speaker laughed softly. I believe you possess something belonging to me. Holmes said nothing. The voice continued. Open the door voluntarily, and your companion, Doctor, Watson, may yet survive the morning. Holmes glanced toward me briefly. Then, to my astonishment, he smiled. A poor bluff, said he calmly. The reply came at once. Is it? A gunshot exploded through the window behind us. Glass shattered inward violently. Gabriel Vale cried out once, and fell back lifeless across the bed. Mrs. Bellamy screamed. Holmes spun toward the broken window, just in time to see a dark figure vanish across the rooftop opposite. Then, from beyond the bolted door came the quiet voice again. Now, Mr. Holmes. Shall we continue negotiating? Chapter 9. The Man Called Seraph. There are occasions in life when danger descends so suddenly and completely that thought itself becomes secondary to instinct. Such was the situation in that Limehouse lodging house. Gabriel Vale lay dead upon the bed, blood spreading darkly across the blankets. Rain blew through the shattered window, while footsteps shifted outside the bolted door. Holmes alone appeared perfectly composed. He glanced once toward Vale's body, then calmly extinguished the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. Mrs. Bellamy gave a frightened gasp. Silence, Holmes whispered. The voice beyond the door laughed softly. A theatrical gesture, Mr. Holmes. Holmes moved noiselessly beside the window. Another shot cracked through the darkness, splintering the door panel inches above my shoulder. Mrs. Bellamy cried out again. Down, I hissed, dragging her behind the bed. Holmes spoke quietly into the darkness. You overestimate your position, the unseen man answered instantly. Do I? Then came the heavy crash of a shoulder striking the door. Once, twice, the rotten wood groaned violently. Holmes suddenly seized my arm. The roof. Before I could reply, he had already climbed through the shattered window into the rain-swept night beyond. I followed at once, helping Mrs. Bellamy after me just as the door burst inward behind us. Voices shouted. A lantern beam slashed through the room. Then we were scrambling across the slick rooftop, while rain lashed our faces and the Thames black below, like moving oil. Holmes ran with astonishing agility, despite the dangerous footing. This way. We leapt a narrow gap between buildings and descended a slanted roof toward a fire escape. Behind us came pursuit. One of the attackers fired wildly. The bullet ricocheted from brick near Holmes' head. Careful, Watson. We reached the iron stairs and descended rapidly into an alley thick with fog and smoke from nearby factories. Holmes turned sharply twice, through twisting passages clearly familiar to him from earlier investigations. At last we emerged into a crowded dockside street, where labourers and sailors still moved beneath the rain despite the late hour. Only then did Holmes slow. Mrs. Bellamy leaned heavily against the wall, breathing hard. They'll keep hunting us. Yes, said Holmes quietly. That is now unavoidable. I stared back toward the maze of alleys behind us. Who are these men? Holmes' expression became grim. The servants of a highly disciplined intelligence network. You truly believe this seraph directs them? I am now certain, Mrs. Bellamy spoke suddenly. You have not seen him? Holmes turned toward her. No, he never appears twice alike. What do you mean? He uses disguises constantly. Different accents, different clothes, even different posture. Holmes' eyes glinted. Interesting. He could stand beside you in daylight, and you would never recognize him. My dear madam, said Holmes dryly, that is a possibility which has occurred to me. We found temporary refuge in the rear room of a riverside tavern, known to Holmes through former inquiries. The proprietor, a scarred ex-prizefighter named Mullins, admitted us without question. You're in trouble again, Mr. Holmes, said he gravely. Frequently. Mullins glanced uneasily toward the windows. This lot feels different. Holmes nodded. You perceive accurately. The man departed after bringing brandy and food. Holmes immediately turned to Mrs. Bellamy. Now we speak plainly. She lowered her exhausted eyes. I have hidden too long already. You possess the second manuscript fragment. Yes. Where? In a bank vault under another name. Holmes nodded approvingly. At last, Prudence. Mrs. Bellamy looked toward the rain outside. Harker entrusted it to me before he disappeared. Why you? Because he knew Bellamy would betray him. Holmes leaned forward. Harker understood the danger already, yes. He feared Seraph. At the name she visibly shuddered. You know more about this man than you have admitted. She hesitated. Then very quietly, I met him once. Holmes became perfectly still. Describe the encounter. It was in Vienna 6 years ago. After Harker vanished? Yes. She clasped her trembling hands together. He approached me in a hotel garden, perfectly polite, perfectly calm. What did he want? The manuscript fragment. And when you refused, he smiled. Her voice dropped lower. He told me that eventually everyone serves him, through greed, fear, or grief. A silence followed. Holmes' face had grown unusually hard. Did he give a name? No. Appearance? Average height. Grey eyes, perhaps. Nothing distinctive. Holmes sighed softly. A professional chameleon. Mrs. Bellamy looked toward him suddenly. You are beginning to understand now. Yes. He already controls men inside the docks, shipping offices, hotels, even the police, perhaps. Lestrade would have exploded at such a suggestion, but Holmes merely nodded thoughtfully. Entirely plausible. I could restrain myself no longer. But what is the purpose of all this, even if the archive exists? Why such obsession over forgotten documents? Holmes answered quietly, because information outlives governments. The words lingered heavily in the dim tavern room. Holmes continued. Imagine correspondence capable of ruining diplomats, exposing financiers, blackmailing aristocrats, implicating military officials across Europe. Mrs. Bellamy whispered. Harker believed entire ministries could collapse. And Seraph intends controlling that power. Holmes rose abruptly, which means he cannot permit witnesses. He crossed toward the window and carefully lifted the curtain edge. Then he froze. What is it? I whispered. 2 men outside. Watching? Yes. Mrs. Bellamy went pale again. Holmes let the curtain fall. They found us faster than expected. How? He looked toward her steadily. You were followed from the hospital. She covered her face. I'm sorry. There is no profit in apologies. Holmes paced slowly. At present, Seraph possesses 1 manuscript fragment. You possess another. Bellamy's stolen section likely became the 3rd. I frowned. Then he already has all 3. No, Holmes replied instantly. Otherwise we would already be dead. The logic struck me at once. He still requires something else. Precisely. Mrs. Bellamy looked up sharply. The key. Holmes turned. There is another cipher? She nodded reluctantly. Harker feared even divided manuscripts were insufficient protection. He created a final translation key. Where? I do not know. Holmes studied her face carefully. But you suspect. She hesitated too long. My dear madam, Holmes said softly, Vale died because of these secrets. More deaths will follow unless concealment ends now. At last she whispered. Harker hid the key in London before leaving for Syria. Where? He never told me directly. Only once he mentioned a phrase repeatedly. What phrase? She closed her eyes briefly. The dead keep perfect records. Holmes's expression altered instantly. Ah, you know what it means, I cried. Possibly. Holmes seized his coat at once. We leave immediately. Where are we going? He looked toward me with sudden fierce excitement. To the one place in London where the dead indeed keep records. The realization struck me at once. St. Bartholomew's? No. Holmes smiled thinly. Highgate Cemetery. Rain still fell heavily as we departed through the tavern's rear entrance. Holmes led us by obscure alleys and river passages, clearly chosen to evade pursuit. Twice he halted suddenly to observe the streets behind us, and once he changed our cab midway through the journey without explanation. At length we reached Highgate shortly before dawn. The cemetery loomed beneath the rain like some vast Gothic city of the dead. Rows of dripping monuments, angels blackened by soot, and towering mausoleums vanishing into mist. Holmes moved rapidly among the paths with surprising certainty. You know where you're going? I believe so. How? Harker adored symbolism, Mrs. Bellamy whispered anxiously. What if Seraph already knows? Then we are already too late. We descended toward the older eastern section where neglected tombs leaned crooked beneath overgrown ivy. At last Holmes halted before a weathered mausoleum bearing the inscription. Elias Harker born 1849. Presumed lost in Syria 1889, I stared. He had a tomb? An empty one, Holmes replied quietly. Mrs. Bellamy shivered. Harker arranged it before departing. Holmes examined the structure carefully. Then suddenly he knelt beside the stone steps. Here. A tiny iron compartment lay concealed beneath the moss-covered base. Holmes pried it open using his pocket-knife. Inside rested a small brass cylinder. Mrs. Bellamy gave a broken whisper. The key. Holmes unscrewed the cylinder carefully. Within lay a narrow strip of paper covered in strange symbols and numerical markings. Holmes' eyes blazed with triumph. At last. But at that instant a slow clapping sound echoed through the cemetery mist. All three of us turned sharply. A man stood 20 yards away beneath the dripping trees, tall, elegant, wrapped in a dark overcoat. A lantern glowed faintly beside him. I could not distinguish his features clearly through the rain. Yet something about his posture radiated absolute confidence. Well done, Mr. Holmes, he said softly. The voice was calm, educated, almost pleasant. Mrs. Bellamy uttered a terrified gasp. Seraph. The man inclined his head slightly. Good evening, Clara. Holmes stepped subtly before us. You followed admirably. Seraph smiled. No, Mr. Holmes, I anticipated. His gloved hand emerged slowly from his coat, holding a revolver. You have saved me considerable effort, he said gently. And now, I fear, our association must end. Chapter X. The Cipher of Elias Harker. There are few men, even among the hardened criminals whom I encountered beside Sherlock Holmes, who possessed the chilling self-command of the individual known as Seraph, standing there amidst the rain-dark tombs of Highgate Cemetery, with the lantern light wavering faintly across his motionless figure. He appeared less like an ordinary fugitive than some patient and inevitable force which had at last stepped from shadow into substance. Holmes alone met him without visible alarm. You disappoint me, said Holmes quietly. Seraph smiled faintly. Do I? I expected a more original entrance. The man gave a soft laugh. Humour at gunpoint is either bravery or vanity. With me, Holmes replied. The distinction is often academic. I had already drawn my revolver, though I confess the situation appeared hopeless. Seraph stood too far for certainty in the dim rain, while somewhere beyond the tombs I sensed, rather than saw movement among the mist. We were surrounded. Mrs. Bellamy clutched my arm desperately. He never comes alone. Holmes' gaze never left Seraph. Your men are unnecessary. On the contrary, said Seraph pleasantly. Experience has taught me never to underestimate either you or Dr. Watson. The mention of my name in that calm voice produced a singularly unpleasant sensation. Holmes slipped the brass cylinder silently into his coat. You already possess the manuscript fragments, said he. Why pursue the key personally? Because I do not delegate important matters, yet you delegated murder. Seraph tilted his head slightly. A regrettable necessity. Mrs. Bellamy cried out, You killed Harker. The man regarded her almost sadly. Harker killed himself the moment he chose deception. Holmes' eyes sharpened. So he truly never possessed the archive location. No. Then what did he possess? Seraph smiled. Enough to become troublesome. Rain drummed softly upon the monuments around us. Holmes spoke again. You have spent 6 years hunting shadows. Not shadows, Seraph corrected gently. Probabilities. And now? Now the game concludes. His revolver lifted slightly. Kindly give me the cylinder. Holmes sighed. My dear sir, you display all the imagination of a tax collector. Seraph's expression did not alter. You misunderstand your position. No, said Holmes softly. I understand it perfectly. Then, to my utter astonishment, Holmes tossed the brass cylinder directly toward him. Seraph caught it one-handed. For the briefest instant, his attention shifted downward. Holmes moved like lightning. He seized Mrs. Bellamy and hurled her behind the mausoleum, while simultaneously striking my arm downward. A gunshot exploded above us. Then another. Chaos erupted across the cemetery. Holmes shouted, "Run!" We plunged through the rain among the tombstones, while bullets shattered stone around us. Behind came furious voices. One attacker rushed from the mist directly into my path. I struck instinctively with the butt of my revolver and heard the fellow collapse heavily among the graves. Holmes darted ahead with extraordinary speed despite the slippery ground. This way. We vaulted a low iron fence and descended toward the eastern gate. Suddenly a cry rang out behind us. Not one of pursuit, pain. Holmes glanced back sharply. A dark figure had emerged from the fog behind Seraph himself. There came another shot, then confusion among the attackers. For one incredible instant I saw Seraph stagger. Interesting, Holmes murmured. Who fired? I cannot yet imagine. But the interruption proved sufficient. We reached the outer road and vanished into the rain-soaked streets beyond before pursuit reorganized itself. Only when we had crossed nearly half a mile of deserted lanes did Holmes finally halt beneath a railway bridge. Mrs. Bellamy leaned weakly against the wall, pale with exhaustion. You gave him the key. Holmes smiled faintly. Did I? From his inner pocket, he calmly produced the brass cylinder. I stared in amazement. The real one. Naturally. Then what did you throw? Holmes withdrew another object from his coat, a cigar tube of nearly identical appearance. My dear Watson, preparedness is the soul of survival. Mrs. Bellamy gave a faint hysterical laugh. For the first time, she whispered. I begin to understand why men fear you. Holmes ignored the compliment entirely. Instead, he examined the cylinder beneath the dim railway lamp. At last, said he softly, we may discover what Harker concealed. He unscrewed the compartment carefully. Inside lay the coded strip we had already seen. Holmes unfolded it fully now for the first time. The markings consisted of Syriac characters, interspersed with columns of numbers and peculiar geometric symbols. I peered over his shoulder helplessly. It means nothing to me, nor should it. Holmes' eyes gleamed. This is not language alone. It is positional encoding. Mrs. Bellamy frowned. Harker devised it during our travels in Constantinople. Holmes looked up sharply. You assisted him, a little. Then, perhaps, you can answer something. What? Holmes pointed toward one recurring symbol, resembling a crooked star. This appears repeatedly beside numerical references. What did it signify? She stared at it. Then suddenly her face changed. The monastery. What monastery? The ruins near Aleppo where Harker found the manuscript. Holmes became intensely alert. Continue. There was a mosaic upon the monastery floor. Harker copied symbols from it constantly. Holmes' expression sharpened further. The cipher key derives from the mosaic. Yes. He folded the paper thoughtfully. Excellent. I confess my bewilderment grew complete. You can decipher it? Not entirely yet. Then what now? Holmes glanced toward the paling eastern sky. Now we require Bellamy. Mrs. Bellamy recoiled instantly. No. He alone may know enough about the manuscript structure to complete translation. He cannot be trusted. Undoubtedly not. Holmes replaced the cylinder inside his coat. Nevertheless, he remains essential. We returned cautiously toward Baker Street shortly after dawn. London emerged slowly from rain and fog as milk carts rattled through the streets and weary labourers drifted toward factories beneath the grey morning sky. Yet Holmes remained deeply thoughtful. "You are troubled," I observed. "Yes, by Seraph, partly." Holmes lit a cigarette. "The shot at Highgate interests me profoundly. The unknown gunman." "Precisely. You think one of Seraph's own men turned against him?" "Possible." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Or someone else hunts him independently." Mrs. Bellamy whispered. "Moberly." Holmes glanced toward her. "Ah, you think him capable?" "Yes." Holmes smoked in silence for several moments. "My dear madam, I begin increasingly to suspect Mr. Lionel Moberly possesses motives far deeper than loyalty to Harker." When we reached Baker Street, Lestrade awaited us in furious agitation. "Where the devil have you been?" "Exploring cemeteries," said Holmes pleasantly. The inspector stared. "I've half the yard searching London for you." "How flattering." Lestrade slammed a newspaper upon the table. "You'd better look at that." The morning edition carried a bold headline: "Mysterious shooting in Highgate Police Suspect." Forum gang activity Holmes skimmed it briefly. "Exaggerated as usual." Lestrade pointed angrily toward Mrs. Bellamy. "And who's this lady?" Holmes removed his coat calmly. "The late Mrs. Bellamy." Lestrade's jaw literally dropped. "You can't mean—" "I do." The inspector sank heavily into a chair. "I'm getting too old for this." Holmes handed him the brass cylinder. Lestrade blinked. "What's this?" "The reason 3 people are dead and several more soon may be." The inspector examined the coded strip helplessly. "It looks like a drunken spider crawled through ink. An apt description." Lestrade looked up sharply. "Can you read it?" "Partially." "And what does it reveal?" Holmes' expression grew grave. "A location in London." "Where?" "I am not yet certain." Lestrade rubbed his forehead miserably. "Well, that's comforting." Holmes crossed suddenly to the bookshelf and withdrew Bellamy's remaining Syriac pages from a locked drawer where he had earlier concealed them after the theft, spreading both manuscript and cipher upon the table. He bent over them with extraordinary concentration. For nearly an hour no one spoke. At last Holmes straightened abruptly. "Ah!" Lestrade nearly jumped from his chair. "What?" Holmes pointed toward a line of translated symbols. "The archive was never hidden in a building." "Then where?" Holmes's face had become very pale. "Underground." A silence followed. Mrs. Bellamy whispered, "Under London?" "Yes." Holmes traced another passage rapidly, specifically beneath. He stopped suddenly. "What is it?" I demanded. Holmes stared fixedly at the decoded text. Then he laughed once, a short humourless sound. "My dear Watson," said he quietly, "our adversary's brilliance exceeds even my expectations." "Why?" Holmes looked slowly upward. "Because the archive has been hidden for 40 years in the one place no one would ever think to search." Lestrade leaned forward impatiently. "Where?" Holmes folded the papers carefully. "Scotland Yard." Chapter 11. Beneath Scotland Yard. Had Holmes suddenly announced that the crown jewels were concealed beneath the Thames, he could scarcely have produced greater astonishment than followed his final words. "Scotland Yard?" cried Lestrade. Holmes nodded calmly. "Extraordinary though it appears." The inspector stared as though uncertain whether insult or madness confronted him. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that some secret archive capable of blackmailing half Europe has been sitting under police headquarters for 40 years. "My dear Lestrade," Holmes replied dryly, "history frequently hides itself beneath bureaucracy." Lestrade rose indignantly. "This is absurd, possibly." Holmes tapped the manuscript pages. "Yet the cipher refers repeatedly to construction undertaken during the river embankment expansion of 1855. That proves nothing. It also references restricted tunnels beneath the old administrative vaults." Lestrade opened his mouth, then shut it again. Holmes continued, "Consider the elegance of the concealment. No thief searches a police headquarters. No government imagines foreign intelligence buried beneath its own offices." Mrs. Bellamy spoke softly. "Harker once said the safest hiding place is the one protected by routine." Holmes inclined his head approvingly. "Precisely." Lestrade still looked unconvinced. "And Seraph knows this?" Holmes' expression darkened. I fear he now knows nearly everything. A heavy silence settled over the room. Then I asked the question troubling me most deeply. What exactly is contained within this archive? Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his cigarette before replying. From Harker's references, diplomatic letters, secret financial agreements, military correspondences, names of informants, covert transactions between European ministries and Ottoman intermediaries. Blackmail indeed, murmured Lestrade. More than blackmail, Holmes corrected quietly. Destabilization. Mrs. Bellamy looked toward the window anxiously. If Seraph obtains it. He acquires leverage over governments. Holmes folded the cipher carefully and slipped it into his pocket, which explains the scale of his organization. Lestrade frowned. You still haven't told me who this fellow really is. Holmes smiled faintly. That omission is intentional. What? My dear Lestrade, until this morning I possessed only theories. I now possess certainty. The inspector leaned forward eagerly. Well? Holmes shook his head. Not yet. Lestrade exploded. Confound it, Holmes. People are dying while you speak in riddles. Holmes' eyes hardened instantly. And if I accuse the wrong man prematurely, more will die. The room fell silent. At last Holmes spoke again in a calmer tone. There remains one essential question unanswered. What's that? I asked. The shot at Highgate. Lestrade groaned. You're still thinking about that? Constantly. Holmes moved toward the fireplace. Someone attempted to kill Seraph. Perhaps one of his own men. No. Holmes shook his head slowly. The shot came from elevation behind the mausoleum, not from among his followers, Mrs. Bellamy whispered. Moberly. Holmes glanced sharply toward her. You are increasingly persuasive on that point. Because I know him. Holmes considered this carefully. Then, perhaps it is time we located Mr. Lionel Moberly. Lestrade snorted. We already tried. He vanished. Holmes smiled. Not vanished. Withdrawn, and the difference? Vanishing is accidental. Withdrawal is tactical. He reached for his coat abruptly. Come, Watson. Where? To speak with an undertaker. I confess my bewilderment by this stage had become nearly habitual. Nevertheless, I followed him through the crowded morning streets, while Lestrade departed reluctantly for Scotland Yard, after extracting repeated promises that Holmes would inform him before taking further action. The undertaker's establishment stood near Paddington in a narrow terrace lined with gloomy shops. Holmes entered without hesitation. The proprietor, a thin elderly man with mournful whiskers, recognised Holmes immediately. Mr. Holmes, what an honour. You handled the memorial arrangements for Elias Harker in 1889. The man blinked in surprise. Yes, though there was no burial, quite. Holmes removed a sovereign casually. I require the original records. Within minutes, dusty ledgers appeared upon the desk. Holmes examined them swiftly. Then suddenly his finger stopped. Ah, what is it? I asked. Holmes turned the book toward me. Beside Harker's name appeared the signature authorizing the memorial construction. Not Adrian Bellamy. Not Clara Bellamy. Lionel Moberly. Holmes smiled very slowly. Excellent. You think Moberly knew about the hidden compartment all along? My dear Watson, said Holmes softly, I think Moberly knew far more than he ever admitted. We left immediately. Well, I demanded once outside. Holmes hailed a cab. To Charing Cross Station, he told the driver. Then, turning toward me, Moberly arranged Harker's false tomb personally. Therefore he knew the cipher key might be hidden there. Yet he never retrieved it. Exactly. Why not? Holmes' eyes narrowed. Because he lacked one essential element. The manuscript fragments. Precisely. The cab rattled southward through dense traffic, while Holmes sank once more into deep thought. At last he said quietly, There is another point I have neglected too long. What? Seraph never attempted to kill Bellamy. I stared. But surely... No. Holmes shook his head firmly. The knocking, intimidation, surveillance, yes. Yet every opportunity for murder passed unused. Why? Because Bellamy remained useful. The realization struck me instantly. He could interpret the manuscript. Exactly. Holmes smiled grimly. Our adversary required Bellamy alive until translation completed. And now? Holmes looked toward the crowded streets beyond the cab window. Now Bellamy's usefulness may have ended. We reached Charing Cross shortly after noon. Holmes moved rapidly through the station concourse, scanning faces with extraordinary intensity. What are we seeking? A man preparing to flee. And if Moberly isn't here, he is. The certainty in Holmes' voice startled me. Suddenly he seized my arm. There. Near the far platform stood Lionel Moberly in travelling clothes, speaking quietly with a porter beside a luggage cart. Holmes strode directly toward him. Moberly saw us instantly. For the briefest moment surprise crossed his features. Then composure returned. "Mr. Holmes, you travel unexpectedly. Business, abroad? Possibly." Holmes smiled thinly. How unfortunate. I had hoped to discuss Elias Harker. Moberly's eyes hardened slightly. There is little left to discuss. On the contrary, Holmes lowered his voice. You concealed the most important truth of all. A long silence followed amid the noise of the station. At last, Moberly said quietly, "Not here." Holmes inclined his head. Agreed. We followed him into the station refreshment room where private booths lined the rear wall. Once seated, Moberly spoke first. "You know then?" "Nearly." Moberly gave a weary laugh. "You always were dangerous. We have never met before." "No," said Moberly softly. "But I studied your methods years ago." Holmes' eyes flashed. "Interesting." Moberly removed his gloves slowly. "You believe I attempted to kill Seraph. I know you did. And yet he survived." "Yes." Moberly looked suddenly exhausted. "He survives everything." Holmes leaned forward. "You knew him before Harker did." The older man closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." "Who is he?" Moberly looked directly at Holmes. "His real name is Daniel Erath." Holmes became perfectly still. "You are certain?" "I recruited him myself in Constantinople 20 years ago." A chill passed through me at the quiet certainty of the statement. "For what purpose?" Holmes asked. "Intelligence gathering, smuggling, political negotiations. He possessed extraordinary gifts, and extraordinary ambition." Moberly nodded grimly. "He learned too quickly." Holmes' voice grew softer. "Then Seraph was never merely hunting the archive." "No." "What then?" Moberly's expression darkened profoundly. "He built the archive." Silence crashed over the booth like a physical force. Holmes' eyes narrowed to slits. "Explain." Harker discovered fragments of Erath's hidden network years ago. The archive was not historical accident. It was operational intelligence gathered systematically across decades. By Seraph himself. Yes. Moberly leaned closer. "He never intended blackmail alone, Holmes. He intended control, and Harker threatened exposure." "Exactly." Holmes sat back slowly. "My God." Moberly's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "You still do not fully understand." "Then enlighten me." Moberly looked toward the bustling station beyond the booth. "Daniel Erath is not fleeing London. Why should he? He already owns half the routes in and out of it." Holmes became very still again. "Moberly." "Yes. Where is Bellamy?" The older man hesitated. Then quietly. "Dead." Chapter 12. The vault beneath the river, even Holmes, master though he was of emotional restraint, showed visible shock at Moberly's final word. "Dead?" Moberly nodded grimly. "When? An hour ago." "How?" "Knife wound." A terrible silence followed. I found myself recalling Bellamy's pale, haunted face beside the fire at Caversham Square. The exhaustion, the terror, the furtive evasions of a man who had long understood death advancing steadily toward him. Holmes spoke at last. "Where is the body? At his house. And Seraph?" "Gone?" Holmes' eyes hardened. "No, not gone." Moberly looked at him steadily. "You still believe you can stop him?" "I know I must." Moberly gave a bleak smile. "Then we are equally cursed." Holmes rose abruptly. "You will accompany us." "To Scotland Yard?" "Yes," Moberly laughed softly. "There is irony in that. Life rarely attempts originality." Within half an hour we had rejoined Lestrade at the Yard. The inspector received news of Bellamy's death with stunned disbelief. Murdered inside his own home. Holmes nodded. "When were you informed?" "Minutes before arriving here," said Moberly quietly. Lestrade turned sharply. "And why should I trust you?" "You should not." The bluntness appeared to disconcert even the inspector. Holmes intervened. Lestrade, we no longer possess the luxury of suspicion without action. Then tell me plainly, who is Seraph? Holmes removed his gloves slowly. A man named Daniel Erath. Lestrade frowned. Never heard of him. That is precisely the problem. Holmes paced before the office fireplace. Erath operated for years across Ottoman territories under diplomatic and commercial disguises, intelligence gathering, information trafficking, covert negotiations. A spy? More dangerous than a spy. Holmes stopped. He understood that governments change but secrets endure. Moberly added quietly, "The archive beneath this building is the product of 20 years' accumulation." Lestrade stared around the room, instinctively. "You mean it's here? Under us?" Holmes nodded. "And Seraph now possesses every element required to access it." A silence followed. Then Lestrade swore violently. "Well, why are we standing here talking?" Holmes' eyes flashed. "Because we must determine where beneath the yard it lies hidden." Lestrade seized his hat. "I can have every cellar searched within the hour." "No," Holmes spoke sharply. "That would warn Erath immediately. He already knows we're onto him, perhaps, but he does not yet know whether we understand the archive location." Holmes crossed swiftly toward the building plans mounted upon the wall. "Show me the original embankment foundations." Lestrade produced old engineering schematics from a cabinet. For several minutes Holmes studied them in silence, then suddenly he pointed. "Here." The marked section lay beneath the oldest administrative wing adjoining the river-facing foundations. "A maintenance tunnel," Holmes murmured. Lestrade frowned. "Unused for years." "Exactly." Moberly stepped closer. "Harker mentioned underground water access once." Holmes nodded. "The tunnel connects to drainage channels beneath the Thames embankment." Lestrade looked uneasy. "You think Seraph intends entering from the river?" "My dear fellow," Holmes replied quietly. "That is how he has moved through London all along." The realization struck all of us simultaneously. The docks, the wharves, the boats, the riverside murders. Everything connected through the Thames. Holmes turned instantly toward Lestrade. "How many men can you trust absolutely?" The inspector blinked. "Trust? Yes, completely." Lestrade hesitated longer than I liked. "Perhaps 6. Bring only those 6. Moberly gave a grim nod. "He'll expect police presence above ground." "Not below." Holmes checked his revolver calmly. "Then we descend before him." It was nearly dusk when we entered the lower foundations of Scotland Yard. A narrow iron staircase led downward into ancient brick corridors damp with river moisture. Gas lamps cast wavering yellow light across sweating walls, while somewhere far below came the dull echo of moving water. Lestrade's chosen men followed silently behind us. No one spoke above a whisper. Holmes moved ahead carrying the cipher papers. "The symbols reference 3 arches," he murmured. "Then a flooded passage. Yes." The tunnels twisted beneath the building like veins beneath stone. At length we reached a heavy iron gate, rusted nearly black with age. Holmes stopped. "Here." Moberly stared ahead grimly. He found it already. The gate stood open. Fresh footprints marked the damp floor beyond. Holmes crouched immediately. 3 men entered recently. "Can you tell which way?" asked Lestrade. Holmes pointed toward the darkness ahead. "Toward the river vault." We advanced cautiously. The air grew colder and thicker with the smell of stagnant water. At last the corridor widened abruptly into a vast subterranean chamber, supported by massive stone pillars, disappearing into shadow overhead. Black water moved slowly through channels along the floor, and at the chamber's centre stood Daniel Erath, Seraph. He had removed the overcoat and gloves now, revealing a tall, spare figure dressed with almost scholarly elegance. His face, illuminated by lantern light, proved astonishingly ordinary. Clean-shaven, pale, intelligent, with calm grey eyes entirely devoid of theatrical villainy. Indeed, had I passed him upon the street, I should never have noticed him at all. Several wooden crates stood open beside him. Within them rested bundles of documents sealed in oilcloth. The archive. Erath looked up as we entered. "Mr. Holmes," he said softly. Holmes lowered his revolver slightly. "You anticipated us?" "Naturally." Erath's gaze shifted briefly toward Moberly. "Lionel, You disappoint me." Mobley's hand tightened around his weapon. "You murdered Bellamy." "No," said Aerith calmly. "Bellamy murdered Bellamy the moment he chose betrayal." Lestrade stepped forward. "In the name of the law." Era smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, the law has financed me repeatedly." Lestrade flushed crimson. Holmes' voice cut sharply across the chamber. "You cannot escape now." Erath regarded him almost sympathetically. "My dear Holmes, escape ceased to concern me years ago." He rested one hand upon the nearest crate. "Do you know what lies here?" "Yes." "Then you understand the temptation." Holmes said nothing. Erath continued quietly. "Ministers ruined. Governments manipulated. Banking houses controlled. Wars redirected before they begin." "You mistake information for power," Holmes replied coldly. "No," said Erath softly. "I mistake it for inevitability." A silence followed, broken only by the slow movement of water beneath the chamber. Then Holmes spoke. "You built the archive gradually." "Yes. Harker discovered part of your network. He was brilliant. Unfortunately, brilliance often develops conscience." "And you killed him." Aerith's face remained perfectly calm. "Harker chose martyrdom. Bellamy chose greed. Clara chose fear. Mobley chose regret." His eyes settled finally upon Holmes. "And you, Mr. Holmes, you chose pursuit." Holmes' revolver remained steady. "Enough philosophy." Erath sighed softly. "I had hoped for better." Then, with astonishing suddenness, the lantern beside him shattered. Darkness exploded across the chamber. Gunfire erupted instantly, voices shouted. A constable screamed somewhere among the pillars. Holmes seized my shoulder. "Left passage." We plunged through darkness lit only by muzzle flashes and swinging lamps. Water splashed beneath our feet. I heard Aerith's calm voice somewhere ahead. "Seal the river gate." Then another shot. Mobley cried out hoarsely. Holmes fired twice toward the sound. The echoes thundered through the vaults like artillery. At last Lestrade's men managed to relight one lantern. Its glow revealed utter confusion. 2 constables wounded, crates overturned, documents scattered across wet stone, and Mobley collapsed against a pillar, clutching his side. But Seraph himself had vanished. Holmes wheeled instantly toward the river tunnel. After him! We pursued through a narrow, flooded corridor, barely high enough to stand upright. Ahead came the sound of rushing water and distant footsteps. Then suddenly the tunnel opened upon a hidden dock beneath the embankment. A small steam launch waited there. Erath stood aboard it calmly beneath the rain, filtering through the grating overhead. He looked almost serene. Holmes levelled his revolver. "Stop!" Erath regarded him steadily. "Tell me, Mr. Holmes, if you possess these documents, would you truly destroy them?" "Yes." Erath smiled faintly. "I do not believe you." The launch drifted backward into darkness. Holmes fired once. The bullet struck the railing beside Erath's shoulder. Then the vessel vanished beneath the tunnel arch into the blackness of the Thames. For several moments no one moved. Rain dripped steadily through the iron grates overhead. At last Lestrade arrived breathless behind us. "Well?" Holmes lowered the revolver slowly. "He's escaped." Lestrade cursed bitterly. "But the archive?" Holmes turned back toward the flooded chamber. "Most of it remains." Mobley was carried out alive, though gravely wounded. The documents themselves occupied Scotland Yard for months afterward, and even then, I doubt the authorities fully comprehended the breadth of information hidden within them. As for Daniel Aerith, no trace of him was ever conclusively discovered. Some claimed he drowned attempting escape through the river tunnels. Others reported sightings in Constantinople, Vienna, or Alexandria under various names. Holmes himself never entirely accepted the man's death. Indeed, several weeks later, while seated once more beside our familiar fire at Baker Street, I ventured to ask him directly. "You still think Seraph lives?" Holmes filled his pipe thoughtfully. "My dear Watson," said he quietly, "men like Erath do not vanish." "Then you expect him to return?" Holmes gazed out toward the fog drifting beyond Baker Street. "I expect," said he softly, "that somewhere at this very moment he is already building another archive." And with that curious remark he reached for his violin, and began to play while the London fog closed thickly against the windows once again. Chapter 13. The final knock. Although the principal events connected with the affair of the Veiled Serpent concluded beneath the foundations of Scotland Yard, there remains one final episode which I cannot omit if this narrative is to present the complete truth. Indeed, it was this last strange occurrence, small in action yet immense in implication, which left the deepest impression upon my mind. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the river vaults. London had resumed its ordinary rhythms. Newspapers gradually abandoned their sensational speculations regarding foreign conspiracies and secret political archives in favour of fresh scandals better suited to public appetite. Lestrade, though privately furious at Seraph's escape, publicly accepted official commendations for recovering the hidden documents. Mrs. Bellamy departed quietly for the continent, under discreet protection arranged through Holmes' private connections. Moberly survived his wounds, though barely, and vanished thereafter into obscure retirement somewhere along the southern coast. As for Holmes, he appeared outwardly unchanged, yet I observed subtle indications that the case lingered deeply in his thoughts. He smoked more heavily than usual. He played long melancholy passages upon the violin late into the night, and twice I surprised him examining the recovered ivory buttons with an expression not of triumph, but calculation. One bleak November evening, shortly after 10 o'clock, I found him seated motionless beside the fire, while rain swept against the windows of Baker Street. "You are thinking of Erath again," said I. Holmes did not immediately answer. "At times," he murmured, "one encounters an adversary who represents not merely criminality, but method. You believe him unique?" "No." Holmes leaned back slowly. "That is precisely what troubles me." Before I could reply, a knock sounded below. Mrs. Hudson ascended moments later carrying a small parcel. "For you, Mr. Holmes." No messenger waited. Holmes took the package sharply. It was wrapped in plain brown paper without address or seal. "Careful," said I instantly. Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, had our correspondent intended explosion, he would hardly have troubled with neat string." Nevertheless, he examined the parcel thoroughly before opening it. Inside lay only 2 objects. The first was an ivory button engraved with the serpent insignia. The second, a folded sheet of paper. Holmes unfolded it silently. Then he handed it to me. The message consisted of a single sentence, written in precise black ink. "You failed to ask, what purchase the archive first?" I looked up sharply. Holmes had become very still indeed. "What does it mean?" Instead of answering, he crossed rapidly toward the bookshelf and withdrew one of the recovered catalogues, copied from Harker's notes. Flipping through several pages, he stopped abruptly. "Good God! What is it?" Holmes pointed toward a coded financial entry partially translated during earlier investigations. Beside a series of payments appeared initials we had previously ignored. "CL. You recognize them?" Holmes' expression hardened. "Yes. Who?" Holmes looked toward the rain-dark window. "Charles Lethbridge." The name struck no memory in me. "Who is he?" "One of the most respected men in the Foreign Office." I stared. "You cannot mean," Holmes interrupted sharply. "I mean exactly that." A silence followed. Then slowly the full implication emerged before me. The archive was already being sold. Holmes nodded grimly. Erath gathered secrets not merely for leverage, but for commerce. And Lethbridge purchased them. At least partially. Holmes paced rapidly across the room. "My dear Watson, do you perceive the brilliance? Governments imagined themselves threatened from outside, while corruption had already entered within." "Then why reveal this now?" Holmes stopped suddenly. "Because Erath wishes me to understand the true scale of the game." A chill passed through me. "You think he sent the parcel?" "Undoubtedly, and he remains in England." Holmes smiled thinly, possibly within half a mile of us. At that instant, another sound came from below. 3 knocks, slow, measured, identical to those which had first echoed through Bellamy's house. Holmes' eyes flashed. Without a word, he seized his revolver and strode toward the stairs. I followed instantly. The front hall lay empty. Mrs. Hudson appeared nervously from the kitchen. "There's no one there, gentlemen." Holmes flung open the door. Rain swept across Baker Street beneath the gas lamps. No figure stood outside. No footsteps retreated through the mist. Only emptiness. Yet something rested upon the threshold. A small black leather notebook. Holmes stooped swiftly and picked it up. Inside were names, dozens of names, politicians, bankers, military officers, diplomats. Beside each appeared dates, sums of money, and cryptic references. Holmes' face became pale as death. "This," he whispered, "is only a fragment of the archive?" "Yes." I stared at him. He left it deliberately. "Of course." Holmes turned several more pages, then abruptly stopped. "What is it?" Without answering, he handed me the notebook. Near the back appeared one final entry, written in fresh ink. Sherlock Holmes. Observation continues. For perhaps the first time in our long friendship, I saw genuine anger in Holmes. Not excitement, not admiration. Anger. He shut the notebook sharply. "Enough. What will you do?" Holmes stood looking out into the rain-soaked street where the fog drifted beneath the lamps like moving ghosts. "At present," said he quietly, "nothing. Nothing, my dear Watson. When an enemy wishes you to pursue him immediately, one should first ask why." He closed the door carefully and returned upstairs. Yet long after midnight, I observed him still seated wakefully beside the fire, with the black notebook open upon his knee and the violin silent at his side. And once, only once, I heard him murmur softly to himself, "Aerith, what are you preparing?" That question, so far as I know, was never answered. For though Sherlock Holmes solved the mystery of the knocking stranger, recovered much of the hidden archive, and exposed the crimes surrounding Elias Harker's death, the man called Seraph passed, finally beyond even Holmes' reach. Yet, whenever fog presses thickly against the windows of Baker Street, and distant footsteps echo faintly through the London night, I sometimes recall those 3 measured knocks, and I confess that even now I find myself listening. Chapter 14. Watson's Last Reflection. Of all the adventures which I have shared with Sherlock Holmes, none has left upon my mind so enduring and unsettling an impression as the singular affair of the stranger who knocked every night. There were other cases more violent, others perhaps more ingenious in their mechanical execution, yet this one alone carried with it the peculiar sensation that our victory, though genuine, remained incomplete, as though we had closed one door only to hear another opening somewhere far beyond our sight. Several months passed after the arrival of the black notebook. Winter descended fully upon London. Snow gathered along the curbs of Baker Street. Chimney smoke drifted low above the rooftops, and the city settled into that strange, muffled stillness peculiar to cold weather. Holmes resumed outwardly ordinary habits. He accepted new clients. He quarrelled with violinists in the newspapers. He spent 2 absurd days disguised as a bookseller in Clerkenwell, pursuing a fraudulent medium. Yet beneath these familiar routines I sensed continual vigilance. More than once I observed him, pausing suddenly beside windows to examine the street below. Twice he interrupted conversations midway in order to inspect anonymous letters before placing them unopened into the fire. And always the black notebook remained locked inside his desk. One January evening, after returning from a medical consultation in Kensington, I found Holmes seated at the table surrounded by documents from the Foreign Office. "You appear industrious," said I, "dangerously so." He handed me a newspaper clipping. The article concerned the abrupt resignation of Sir Charles Lethbridge due to exhaustion and declining health. "You think Aerith forced his resignation?" Holmes lit his pipe thoughtfully. "I think Lethbridge received a private reminder that secrets age poorly. And the government? Governments prefer quiet decay to public scandal." He leaned back. The archive frightened them more than they admitted. I glanced toward the locked desk. "You still examine those records? Constantly? And have you learned more?" Holmes smiled without humour. Far too much. Before I could inquire further, a messenger arrived from Scotland Yard, requesting Holmes' immediate presence regarding a confidential matter. Lestrade himself awaited us there in an unusually grave state. "You remember the notebook?" he asked without preamble. Holmes nodded. We traced several names. "And Lestrade lowered his voice. 3 of the men listed disappeared this month. Holmes's expression did not change. Disappeared voluntarily? That's the troubling part. Lestrade swallowed. 1 turned up dead in Brussels yesterday. I felt a chill immediately. How? Strangled. The inspector hesitated. There was a symbol carved into the hotel desk beside him. Holmes' eyes narrowed. The serpent. Yes. Silence settled heavily across the office. At last, Holmes said quietly, Ereth cleans his accounts. Lestrade slammed a hand upon the table. But why now? Because exposure creates liability. Holmes rose slowly. My dear Lestrade, Seraph spent decades building invisible influence. If even fragments of that structure risk discovery, he will erase every vulnerable connection. You mean murder everyone involved, if necessary. Lestrade muttered an oath. We'll never catch him. Holmes looked toward the darkened office window. No, said he softly. Probably not. It was after leaving the yard that the final and strangest development occurred. As our cab crossed Westminster Bridge through falling snow, Holmes suddenly struck the roof sharply with his cane. Stop! The cab lurched to a halt. What is it? I cried. Holmes stared toward the embankment below. There, a solitary figure stood beneath a gas lamp near the river stairs. Tall, motionless, watching. Even through drifting snow I recognized something familiar in the posture. Holmes descended from the cab immediately. Holmes? But he was already striding toward the embankment. The figure did not flee. As we approached, the man removed his hat slightly in greeting. Daniel Ereth, Seraph himself. For the first time I saw him clearly in full light. He looked older perhaps than during our encounter beneath the yard, though the calm intelligence of his face remained unchanged. Snowflakes settled upon his dark coat, while the river moved black and silent behind him. Holmes stopped several feet away. You are either brave, said he quietly, or exhausted. Ereth smiled faintly. Neither, merely curious. I had already drawn my revolver beneath my coat, but Holmes gave the slightest motion restraining me. You risk much appearing here. Ereth glanced toward the river. Not greatly. Your police watch the wrong stations. Holmes' eyes hardened. Why contact me? Professional courtesy. That would be novel. Ereth laughed softly. You continue to misunderstand me, Holmes. Enlighten me. The man studied him for several moments before speaking. Do you know why I admired Elias Harker? Because he was useful? No. Ereth shook his head gently. Because he realized nations are temporary illusions. Holmes remained silent. Ereth continued. Kings die. Ministries collapse. Borders change. Yet information survives all of them. And so you made yourself its keeper. Temporarily. The wind swept snow across the embankment in pale spirals. Holmes spoke at last. You could still surrender. Ereth smiled sadly. My dear Holmes, to whom? Neither man moved. At length Holmes asked quietly, Why spare me? Ereth considered the question seriously. Because, said he at last, you are one of the very few men who truly saw the structure beneath the performance. Holmes' gaze sharpened. And Watson? To my astonishment, Ereth looked directly toward me. Dr. Watson reminds us that decency still exists. Men like Holmes require such reminders. I confess I found no answer. Ereth replaced his hat calmly. The archive you recovered was incomplete. Holmes' eyes flashed instantly. I expected as much. There are others. Where? Ereth smiled faintly. Now you ask the correct question. He stepped backward toward the river stairs. Will we meet again? Holmes asked. Almost certainly. And next time? Ereth paused. Next time perhaps we shall stand upon the same side. With that extraordinary remark he descended the stairs into darkness below the bridge. Holmes sprang forward instantly. We followed at once, but when we reached the river, landing only black water moved beneath the snow. No boat, no footsteps, no trace whatsoever. Holmes remained motionless for several seconds, staring into the darkness. Then at last he turned away. Neither of us spoke during the journey back to Baker Street. It was only after midnight, while Holmes sat once more beside the fire with his violin resting silently across his knees, that I ventured to ask the question troubling me most. Do you believe him? Holmes drew slowly upon his pipe. In which respect? that there are other archives. Holmes' eyes reflected the firelight strangely. "My dear Watson," said he quietly, "after this case I have ceased believing in isolated conspiracies." He lifted the violin at last, and played a low wandering melody, unlike any I had previously heard, from him, something melancholy, unfinished, and deeply distant. And as I listened there in the warm lamplight of Baker Street, while snow drifted silently against the windows beyond, I realised that the case had altered Holmes himself in ways even he scarcely understood. For once he had pursued not merely a criminal, but an idea. And ideas, unlike men, do not die easily. Thus ends my account of Sherlock Holmes and the case of the stranger who knocked. A mystery whose shadows, I suspect, stretched far beyond anything either Holmes or I ever fully discovered.